Thank you everyone for coming today. Very, very happy to welcome you here to this seminar on the future of peacekeeping. What does the future of peacekeeping hold? We've asked this question and we have invited a few wonderful speakers, 5 speakers that are sitting here in the front. And before I introduce them, I just want to say a little bit about why we decided to do this seminar in the first place. I should start out by saying this is actually sort of based on a conversation with Nina and also Jonathan a little bit, because we talked about their new book that came out in 2022 on African peacekeeping, and we wanted to launch it here at DIIS. For various reasons that didn't happen, but we continued the conversation, and this turned then into this seminar with these 5 wonderful speakers that are sitting here at the front. And here we are talking about the future of peacekeeping, and whether it's dead or alive, that's also something that we're going to talk about. It's sort of it sort of died a few times in the presentations, and it's coming back to life at the end. So it's based, there is sort of a idea to the structure where we kill it and then we resuscitate it, and then we show where it's going to head after yeah, we have resuscitated it. So since multidimensional peacekeeping missions of a considerable size were established in the early 2010s in Sudan, in Mali, in the Central African Republic, there's really been a dearth of missions. There has not been new missions that have been established. And of course, as many of you know, Mali was shut down late last year. So what are some of the reasons for this lack of popularity, you could say, of peacekeeping? Well, one reason is clear. There's been a dwindling belief in the West's ability to, with West's legitimacy to engage in peacekeeping around the world. But there's also been a lack of belief in its ability to actually change countries that have been going through conflict into, if not sort of fully functioning liberal democracies, and at least democracies that to some extent could work. And also, of course, there's also okay, sorry. And there are several other reasons why this is the case, of course, as well. So there's a complexity and cost, 2 of the greatest challenges associated with establishing and sustaining large-scale missions. That's also something to do with, obviously, the lack of legitimacy of the West's ability to change the world into functioning democracies. And then, of course, there's also the political will of the Security Council and the Security Council dynamics. The deployment of new peacekeeping missions is contingent upon consensus among permanent members of the Security Council. However, as we are living in what are possibly the most divided era following the end of the Cold War, at least from a Western perspective, with wars in Europe and Middle East, political disagreements and geopolitical rivalries among the Security Council members no doubt shape the possibility of agreeing on the deployment of new missions. So one of the main sort of challenges, of course, is agreement within the Security Council. It's also the fact that missions are deploying in increasingly violent conflicts. So this move from traditional peacekeeping, keeping 2 parties from restarting the fight after having agreed to stop, to the deployment of missions at what can best be described as open conflict. Many of these conflicts involve asymmetric warfare, terrorism, and complex regional dynamics, which pose unique challenges to traditional peacekeeping approaches. But the question is if it's even possible to design missions that can respond to changing conflict dynamics. And then there's also the fact that regional and national solutions are now much more emphasized than they were before. So there's been a growing emphasis on regional and national solutions to conflict, with neighboring countries and regional organizations taking the lead in addressing crisis in their respective regions. And while regional and national approaches can be effective in certain contexts, they also present challenges in terms of coordination and sustainability. For instance, we have seen how troop contributors play out their national interest in the countries where missions are deployed, and this has been very noticeable, obviously in Somalia and Mali. So what does the future of peacekeeping look like? I think we have a star cast to tell us about it in the next couple of hours. They're sitting here in front of me, so I just want to present them from the beginning. The first is Marsha Henry. She's going to start by talking about the end of peacekeeping. She's a newly appointed professor to the Queen's University in Belfast, gender, peace and security professor, something like that. Should we say that? Yeah, that's good. That's good. That's what we go with. And then we have Jonathan Fisher, who is also a professor at the University of Birmingham. He's written extensively, as has Marsha, on peacekeeping and conflict dynamics in East Africa for Jonathan, and more globally, I would say, in the case of Marsha. Then we have Nina Wilén, who is the research director for Egmont in Institute in Belgium, and an associate professor at the University of Lund. Also written extensively on peacekeeping and peacekeeping-related issues, especially in Africa. Then we have we're not in Ghana. So we have Andrew Tchie. He's a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute for International Studies. I would say our sister, brother, whatever we want to call it, institute in Oslo. Also written a lot on peacekeeping, and also specifically on the African Union and its peace enforcement, peace support operation work. And then finally, saving the best for, no, I wouldn't say that, but we definitely have some very good stuff for you at the end with John, who is a research professor at NUPI, written a lot on peacekeeping over the years as well. Also been very good at sort of capturing sort of the newest trends of where peacekeeping is heading, I think, in the work that he's done, not just with the new work on ad hoc coalitions, but also when we started talking about the militarization of peacekeeping. I think also some of the work then was quite sort of foreseeing, would you say? You saw what was coming, basically. So I want to then invite Marsha Henry to come to the floor and start her presentation. Thank you.
See if it works. Can you hear me? Hello, everybody. Okay, so I want to start by thanking Peter for organizing this. I've been here a couple of times talking about more or less the same things. So I hope you're not going to be bored by me banging on about this same point. But what I wanted to thank Peter for was really because actually, Peter, you're sort of like a key conduit, if I could use that term, for engaging the very small, I think, wing of more critical, what I would call more critical peacekeeping scholarship, with a variety of scholars working on it who are engaged in advising peacekeeping institutions, doing field work, doing research on the ground with peacekeepers or with other governance institutions. And so you've really kind of like single-handedly kept this dialogue open and created, I think, a really, well, it's sounding a bit ominous, but a safe space for us to actually talk about the very different ways in which we come to these kinds of issues and this kind of research subject matter. So I wanted to start by saying thank you for that. But then I think I'm in the non-enviable place of being the first person to speak, and I think what I'm going to give you is very much a kind of a very strong, it's taken about 20 years to come to this, but really a very theoretically and politically informed account of why I think we should be moving towards thinking about the abolition of peacekeeping. So I'm going to start with that sort of that very dramatic bit, and then I'll let everyone else tell you why we still need it. But no. So what happened was really, like, I think, so I've been researching on different aspects of peacekeeping for almost 20 years. And, I came at peacekeeping really very, from a feminist perspective. I'd done work on gender and development, and another colleague at the time had been working on gender and militarization, and said, hey, I've read this recent report on sexual exploitation and abuse put out by Save the Children, and I think this, maybe we could combine research interests and we could do this project together. So that was kind of how we started doing it. Now, I guess this is where the kind of entry into the peacekeeping scholarship was really quite different for me, because what I've recently been writing about is that how we come to know about peacekeeping is really quite important. And what I would call the mainstream scholarship really produces peacekeeping as a practice, as an object that's in need of a lot of intervention. It needs a lot of reform, it needs a lot of thinking through, it needs a lot of application. And I came to peacekeeping from a much different sort of epistemic trajectory. So how I came to know peacekeeping was very much through the feminist scholarship, the scholarship that's looking at gender relations and what kind of impact peacekeeping has on gender and the ways in which it reflects a variety of gendered inequalities. I also came to it from the literature that was decolonial or post-colonial perspectives. These were perspectives that were from the outset criticizing peacekeeping as a colonial project, as a project of a civilizing mission, or as a project that had the aim of reforming or transforming societies according to a fairly neoliberal or liberal agenda. And then the other literature that I came to it with, which I think is probably the sort of the literature that you don't tend to see in the mainstream peacekeeping scholarship, was the literature from pacifists, from those who were critiquing, who were anti-militarist, who were critiquing the Marshall foundations of peacekeeping, or the ideologies that are embedded in peacekeeping as it's generally been set up and practiced. So I came at this literature not from perhaps the more traditional international relations or security studies field. So I had a very different kind of teaching into it. And as a result, I think I've been constantly struggling with, whenever I've been in these peacekeeping events or conferences, workshops, etc., I've always been struggling, where can this critical material that I've got in my mind and, that I'm kind of committed to, where can it fit in? Where can we come to some, sort of discussions? We had a workshop here, some years ago before the pandemic. And this actually, and John was on that panel, and there were some things said during that workshop that were really a catalyst for me to not sit on the fence anymore about this abolitionist perspective. I thought, actually, those have made me, sort of committed to this. So essentially what I argue, and this is in a forthcoming book, which is called The End of Peacekeeping. It's out next month. And in it, I sort of talk about, if we actually trace peacekeeping, what we know about peacekeeping and what we can know about peacekeeping through these three critical sort of sets of literatures, we might come out with a very different sort of feeling. We might come out with a very different conviction about the future of peacekeeping. We might actually consider its abolition, its end, because we might agree, it depends, we might agree that there's no saving peacekeeping, that, we can try and resuscitate it as we have been since its inception, but we still have at the core these sort of very problematic ideologies, or these very problematic foundations, both conceptually and then as they're practiced. So I start off, for example, looking at some of the literature on the sort of post-colonial critiques of peacekeeping. So I go back to those. I think like what happened in the early 2000s, like 2004, there was several books written on peacekeeping that were criticizing peacekeeping, the peacekeeping industry, the governance mechanisms, but also what was happening in peacekeeping missions to what I refer to in the book, and others have also referred to them as the peace kept. And I call them the peace kept because they've kind of gone in and out of view, actually, in the peacekeeping scholarship, and even in policy. And when you see the kinds of programs that are funded, very often those who are beneficiaries of peacekeeping policies and practices are kind of like in the margins, if they're at all. So I go back to some of this literature. I mean, a key text that I go back to is this text by Shireen Razik, which is called Dark Threats, White Nights. And in that book, she, unpacks a very specific example of violence committed by Canadian peacekeepers in Somalia. And she does a very interesting exploration of the kinds of ways in which peacekeepers and then the Canadian government recuperate these kinds of narratives about, being essentially the good guys. I think you'll probably know that narrative from Scandinavia and Nordic countries more broadly. How can peacekeepers be bad if they're from Canada or Denmark or Sweden or Norway? I think the Canadians proved that you can do that, definitively in this case. But what she does is look at the ways in which these kinds of examples of violence committed are re-narrated in these very colonial terms. So some of the excuses that were used were, well, the heat and dust got to the Canadian peacekeepers. They were so used to looking out and seeing the clean snows of Petawawa, the indigenous community where Canadian bases are, that they sort of lost their minds, a kind of heart of darkness argument. So that's just one example of this kind of analysis that I returned to. And I thought, how does that kind of analysis, if I think about that analysis, how does it relate to my own experiences of doing field work in Liberia, in Haiti, in Kosovo? Very often peacekeepers themselves, regardless of where they're from, and peacekeeping, civil peacekeepers, not just military peacekeepers, police peacekeepers, they would often narrate very similar kind of ideas. And I'm just thinking about an example from a Balkan peacekeeper who decided that he was going to set up self-defense classes in the local village where he was stationed, and he set out drinks one evening. He organized a space where he could help people have some of this information. He was a martial arts specialist, and he had drinks and biscuits out. And then the first evening, local people came and they ate the biscuits and the juice, and they more or less stayed. And then the next week, he was going to have like 6 sessions. And then the next week, like many fewer people came, they ate the biscuits, and then they left before the session was over. And he was really frustrated. He was like, this people are like, they just don't, he said to me, I am from a post-conflict society. I had peacekeepers in my village telling me how to be. And now I'm in this position where I am here in Buchanan or in Monrovia in Liberia, and I want to help people with the knowledge that I have, and they are ungrateful, or they don't want to be in this space. And so some of these kinds of narratives of the ungrateful native or the ungrateful beneficiary, trickle down to peacekeepers. So that's just one example of the kind of persistence of these types of thinking. And then, I look at also what happens in relation to gender. So I don't know if we'll hear from you, Nina, about that, but Nina's written quite a lot on female peacekeepers, but also on the sort of the benefits of having female peacekeepers. Some of the burdens as well of having female peacekeepers is the burden on the women themselves, who are, having to bear the brunt of this kind of caring and work to limit or reduce incidents of peacekeeper violence, really. And so what I look at is, okay, so the UN has taken up a lot of these criticisms of male-dominated peacekeeping practices, and they've tried to increase the number of female peacekeepers. And then so what has that actually done? Well, in many ways, it has changed, and in some small ways, changed the landscape. But in other ways, it's reified ideas about gender. It's reified ideas about, you know, we still keep having these discussions, for example, about operational effectiveness, like why we're even having those conversations. I don't even think most militaries are having those conversations anymore. Okay, that's not strictly true. The Norwegian government is still having those discussions about operational effectiveness. But, you know, like there's all these studies that definitively show that a person's identity, you know, along ethnic lines, along sexual identification lines, along gender, doesn't really bear very much in terms of contemporary military practices. There is, you know, operational effectiveness has very little in a way to do with the way in which someone is socially situated. So some of the work around female peacekeepers and around gender, and especially around sexual exploitation and abuse, has actually hardened these colonial relationships or these relationships of power. They haven't actually like liberated peacekeeping from some of those developmental humanitarian traps. So that's kind of like the second literature. I turned to feminist work on peacekeeping because I wanted to look at, like, again, in the early 2000s, what happened to all that literature that was critical? Why isn't it taken up in contemporary studies? Why don't we see it referenced? You know, if I pull a book out, you know, latest book on peacekeeping, how many of those texts will appear in the bibliography or will be cited? Very, very few. I can tell you a lot more about the female peacekeepers that I interviewed and the kinds of struggles that they experience. But, you know, we can leave that to the Q&A. And then I guess I just want to get to the heart, I guess, of the ending peacekeeping, which is really about the Marshall foundations of peacekeeping. So even civilian peacekeepers in most of the missions will tell you about when you talk to them, you will see the ways in which they are disciplined by military rituals, by military time. And peacekeepers themselves have to, very often have to buy into ideas of martial prowess or of military superiority in order to keep these jobs, to keep the income going. So, you know, peacekeepers will tell you, like, well, you know, I don't really want to be, you know, I didn't really want to be in this job. I didn't really want to sign up and be sent to all these different destinations. You know, I did it because I knew that I could, you know, make this amount of money, or I could, you know, I could use my physical skills to get into a less arduous job. Actually, if I went on peacekeeping, I probably wouldn't have to do the manual labor that I would have had to do had I stayed. And then we know that, you know, not all militaries are equal. So even though the UN might have, as I've talked about many times before, might have a standard payment plan for militaries, or kind of like a very fair sort of setup of how they reimburse individual militaries, we know that then, of course, that translates very differently depending on how, you know, how your own government as a peacekeeper, how they benefit you. So do they charge you, you know, taxes, or is it tax-free income? You know, many years ago, the Norwegian government used to give police peacekeepers like 6 airline tickets home, 3 of which were business class. You know, when I proposed that to the British military, they freaked out. They were like, no, we can't send civil servants on business class flights. But, you know, it was kind of interesting because part of the rationale for the Norwegian government was like, okay, let's bring actually peacekeepers home. And if we pay for these tickets, then there isn't an issue of, well, should I go home or should I not go home? So part of it was about like certain ideas of family and commitments to family. Some of it was about trying to help peacekeepers get out of peacekeeping missions, to relieve those peacekeeping missions of this international and foreign personnel. And some of it was about like respecting employees and civil servants and giving them the kind of benefits of hard duty, of a harder duty, if we can say that. Yeah, so I think, and I'll just maybe just before I kind of end on that, got time still? Okay, good. I wanted to give you a kind of example of, you know, some of the ideas, the military ideas that also cross over into ideas about gender. In my fieldwork, this was about 2012, I was doing this research in Monrovia and sort of like, you know, I don't know if it was deep hanging out, but it was hanging out with peacekeepers from a lot of different contingents. It was really interesting to look at, you know, how peacekeepers continually constructed themselves as these, you know, as these individuals that, you know, that were in very tough jobs. So if you hear about the Norwegians getting 6 airfares, you might not think so. But peacekeepers had an investment in constructing peacekeeping as extremely hard. And peacekeeping is extremely difficult. And there are lots of issues that come up. There are lots of health issues that come up for peacekeepers. There's lots of family stress on family life that comes up as a result of being deployed for a year or sometimes 3 years in the case of some police peacekeepers. But I was very struck by this one story. So when peacekeepers found out I was doing my research on gender and, you know, that I was doing work on feminist scholarship, they were like, oh, well, you know, we need to tell you a story about the Swedish peacekeeper. So the Swedish peacekeeper who was very visible in the mission. So she was 6 foot tall. So she was, you know, she stood out. And everyone told me the story of how she had a black belt in, I'm not sure what, a martial art. So she was a very advanced martial arts athlete. And she was also known for the fact that she was like a pseudo-professional dancer, right? Okay, so she had all these sort of embodied skills that, you know, sort of were circulating in the mission. This was obviously a very special and unique person. And so there were 2 stories that I found really interesting about her. So one was that she'd been going to the gym and working out, and then there'd been lots of talk of her martial skill, you know, her martial arts skills, and there'd been sort of baiting amongst the peacekeepers, like, why doesn't she have a match with one of the other peacekeepers who also claims he's an expert? And he was declining. No, I don't fight women. I don't fight girls. I don't want to go. Eventually, I think no one could take it anymore, and he relented and got into the ring, so to speak, with her. And you know, it went on for a while, and he defeated her, and it resulted in her having this big black eye. That she'd accepted it, and it was seen as a kind of side effect of this. But all the peacekeepers remember her walking around with this black eye, which they'd seen as a kind of like an honor, badge of honor, right? Like that she'd lost because she was a woman. That was the subtext, but she withstood it, and she walked proudly around, you know, UN headquarters. But a couple of weeks after this incident, she'd been with another woman peacekeeper, and they were off duty on a Sunday, and they'd gone to the nearby beach, and they were just walking along the beach and, you know, sort of going into the water and coming out. Anyway, they had their cameras with them. Sorry for those of you who are very young, cameras, not iPhones. They'd had the cameras with them, and they were taking pictures of the beach and so on. Anyway, and some youth had come up to them and mugged them and threatened them. And they, you know, and when they threatened them, she'd given up the camera. She'd just given up the camera. And there was stories going around, you know, for weeks. They can't believe this woman, martial arts expert, police, you know, advanced training on all regards, tall woman that was like, you know, and that she'd been mugged by these young men on the beach. But there was no understanding of, what kind of agency she might have had in that moment, whether she gave up the camera sort of willingly, whether she actually felt threatened. But the stories that went around were about how essentially, like, we can't really invest everything we have in female peacekeepers. They still need our protection, and even when she's a black belt in this. But I thought it was really interesting that these martial skills were somehow also subject to, they were watered down by one's gender or one's situation, really, one's situatedness in social relations. So I just wanted to kind of just share that examples, just so you can see how these stories and experiences kind of really reflected some of the thinking that I'd been doing over time. So I guess what I started to think was, well, if we keep going back, if all of the experiences of the peacekeepers and then the peace kept, if you keep talking to the peace kept and you keep hearing these stories of kind of humiliation or alienation or nothing's really gotten better, these peacekeepers have been here 15 years. I remember seeing in one of my first fieldwork trips a young man who was standing outside of one of the hotels that lots of the researchers and NGO workers would come and stay at. And he was standing outside of the hotel and he was asking for money because his mom had x-rays done and she'd broken her arm and he needed to pay for those. And so could he have some money? Fast forward 7 years later, I see the exact same guy, Michael, as he was called, on the beach, selling homemade chess set, on the beach. And I said, Michael, I met you 7 years ago when I was here, doing research. And he said, the time hasn't been good to us. The time hasn't been good. The peacekeepers have been here. The peacekeeping institution's been, the peacekeeping structure has been here, and yet, here I am, still struggling to find my way. So I think that, again, it wasn't just that I thought about this 2004 work from Razik or this 2004 work from Coburn and Zarkov or this work on military peacekeeping. I just was struck by this kind of the persistence of these underlying problems with peacekeeping. And I thought, okay, well, what happens if we actually, agree that those foundations, the gendered foundations, the colonial relations, and the martial foundations, if they can't be resuscitated, if they can't be recuperated, then our only alternative is to consider the abolition of peacekeeping. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Marsha. Please stay. I want you to just also stay for a few minutes just to take some questions. I also remember our meeting in 2017. I think what stayed with me, you didn't mention it just in your conclusion here, but the racialized sort of divisions within these missions. And I think what I remember we talked about, obviously Marley Lollesgaard is also here, who allowed us into the mission while he was the commander. Where remember we talked about Chet, who was on the sort of the border with in the north, and we talked about how how long they'd been. They'd been for several years. They had just been almost integrated into the local communities. And there was this other guy, I won't mention his name, we all know him, but what stuck with me from that meeting was that he said they're so brave that they will stay up there on the border and just fight it out for the UN. And where that was really eye-opening for me, because that's such a cynical sort of like comment to make about people that are also forced by circumstances to stay in the mission. So I think sort of the racialized damage, I know that you're also quite interested in that, obviously. And I think an extremely important part of how life is less valued based on where you're from. Let's just leave it at that more vague sort of.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just to pick up on that. But
I mean, it's something that I look at in the chapter around the color line, the global color line, which I use as a kind of device to think about this. But it's not just like, so it's the peacekeepers as well, the inequality amongst peacekeepers that's perpetuated by the way in which the UN continues to lay out peacekeeping or to govern it, really. And then that also then has the effect on the peace kept being the taking center stage, right? So you have, okay, this narrative that like peacekeepers are at risk. That's there's a huge period of time in the late 2000s where you have like this real obsession. I mean, warranted in many ways, but it became like it eclipsed the peace kept, right? Like at one point, because we started to worry about not the Swedish peacekeeper that I mentioned, but really the global South peacekeepers who are the majority of boots on the ground. There were these fatalities. They were, because whether it was the level of operation or the mandate that they had, or whether it was that they were ill-equipped, or that they came, for example, in the case of Haiti, with already, impacted by cholera. So then, who's responsible for those deaths? And yeah. So there's a whole spectrum, but I think that there has been this problematic shift to worrying about peacekeepers a bit more than we worry about the peace kept. Yeah.
So I just want to open the floor to 2 quick questions, if there's anything. There will also be Q&A at the end where the whole panel will be up here. So just if you have some burning question, I can see. Okay, so Lollesgaard, can you?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for a very interesting brief. I'm Mike Rosgaard, former Mali, and also heading the UNMA in Yemen. I think I'm not sure I fully agree with your approach or your analysis here, because what you're talking about is the flaws of the peacekeeping, which there are, like hundreds and thousands. There are low performance. There are all the gender issues that you say. You see sexual exploitation and abuse. But to make a direct line to, okay, let's terminate peacekeeping, I think it's a step too far, because I think we also need to think, okay, what would have happened if there were no peacekeeping? And I can speak for Mali. You can see now we have terminated the mission, and the situation is definitely not getting better. I can tell you we will be back there within the next 5 years in some form or the other. So I think maybe it's very pessimistic to have a direct line between your conclusions on the performance and then the terminating on the peacekeeping. But that's just a comment. I don't know if it's a question.
I will respond to that in a minute, but do you want to take that other one?
Just there was a question over here. Yep. We have 3 minutes to answer the question, so keep it. I'm also talking to the person asking.
Yes, I understand that. I was just wondering, do you think that your line of argument, which I can surely follow, it makes a lot of sense to me, but wouldn't it be so that the main argument for stopping sending peacekeepers out or paying for them from the, if we call it the global north or whatever, wouldn't that be economic cost-benefit calculations more than the ideal analysis of how do we actually benefit anyone? Because I think, no, I'm not going to talk about what I think. I want to listen to what you think.
Okay, so I'll answer that first and then come back to yours. So I think peacekeeping is extremely costly, as other people have researched. Cutting back on peacekeeping, I'm sure there's lots of people who are on the other side of the spectrum of arguments from me who would also agree, let's get rid of peacekeeping, because it would, we could recoup that money and put it into other kinds of humanitarian efforts. I guess the downside of that would be that global South countries, as I was talking about in terms of, peacekeepers from the Balkans, peacekeepers from the southern cone of Latin America and South Asia, West Africa, they rely on those appointments and those deployments quite significantly. And, you know, I have a whole thing on how Balkan peacekeepers really rely on that money, and it's actually transformed a very fragile economy in the Balkans region. So those remittances are not nothing. So I'll just say that, but we could perhaps talk a bit more. And I would just say in relation to this, you know, I think I'm not in disagreement with you about that. I think what I'm trying to do in this book is to say, if we look at the foundations, the thinking of where peacekeeping began and how it's manifested, we have to come to the conclusion that it's the wretch that cannot be saved. Okay, so if we come to that conclusion, then we could think about we could debate the different alternatives. But I would say that if you go to the root of peacekeeping, you can't make that better. You can't make it less racialized unless you think about it from a very different starting point. So I'm not necessarily in disagreement with you. I just think the exercise that I wanted to engage people in and that I wanted to do in this book was to say, okay, let's take this analysis right to the end, and this is the logical conclusion that I reach. And I do sort of say that part of the problem with the saving lives logic is that we concentrate on the saving lives, but we don't think about the larger long-term consequences. So yes, lives saved, but you know, are we going to get into a sort of balance sheet? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Let me turn this off.
So we're starting the resuscitation with the next presentation. Now it's only multilateralism that might be dead, and we have regional stabilization forces taking their place. So Nina, Jonathan, please take the stage.
Yeah, so perhaps.
Are you good?
Yeah.
You good?
Yeah.
Good.
So this is the reason why we first starting talking about coming here, and I guess can you hear me now? So we started this book in 2016, more or less. And the trends that we're going to identify now started a little bit before 2016, but because Jonathan was really slow in getting us started on this book, it only came out last year. And apparently we still need to pay for the indexing, and we have one more example here in case anybody is interested. So what we're going to present today is a little bit a continuation of how we thought about this book, so African peacekeeping. Peacekeeping by Africans in Africa. And since we wrote the book, but also previously during this whole period, we've seen that peacekeeping as we've understood it is perhaps not the same anymore. We're seeing this shift over the past decade, we would argue, that's kind of profoundly changing the African, particularly the African peace and security architecture and the way that we see peace operations and peacekeeping on the African continent. So we are trying now, this is a new project, so bear with us if we don't have any clear theoretical concept to encapsulate all of what we're saying today, and we're happy to hear your feedback on that. But we're trying to identify 5 broader trends that we can see on the African continent right now. And we're going to illustrate them with empirical examples. And I know that some of you here in the room have much better experience from these, from the trends that we're seeing, people who have been in the peace operations themselves. But I hope that we can kind of give you an overall view of what we're seeing right now. So starting then with these 5 trends, the first trend that we're seeing is perhaps the end of multilateral, multidimensional peacekeeping as we know it, like these huge UN peace operations with what has been called Christmas tree mandates, where they're supposed to basically do everything with limited resources and with a limited force in huge territories. And I'm going to take up 2 examples of that in a little bit. And perhaps that we've seen that since 2014, the UN has not issued any of these multi-dimensional peace operations anymore, in spite of the fact that armed conflicts are rising. And now I'm focusing on the African continent, but of course that's a global phenomena. And also Peter was touching upon that we're also seeing the global power competition that's paralyzing the UN Security Council in issuing new peace operations and also doing all kinds of things, right? So we are in a very difficult moment for multilateralism. We call it the crisis of multilateralism. So we haven't seen these peacekeeping operations, but we've also witnessed, especially on the African continent, a wavering consent from the host states to these peace operations. Consent is being one of the three main reasons or main fundamental principles of UN peacekeeping for peace operations to be deployed is consent from the host state. And what we've seen now is that this consent is a bit fragile. And we're giving two empirical examples of that. The first one is MINUSMA. MINUSMA being deployed in Mali for a decade, kicked out by the Malian junta last year, which over the last 3 years, since there were 2 coups in Mali in 2020 and 2021, just saw their space continuously decrease. Like their implementation of the mandate was already very difficult before the coups, but it became increasingly difficult after the coups. And of course, I'm not going to go into details on this here, but you could see that the Malian junta decided that they were going to constrain the political and military space for the UN peace operation by, for example, imposing no-fly zones on almost half of the territory, asking for authorization for drone flights, which is collecting reconnaissance or intel for the peacekeepers so that you can better protect the peacekeepers, like Marsha said. And if there has been one mission where protecting peacekeeper has been essential, it's been in MINUSMA, which has also seen the highest number of casualties in any modern peacekeeping operation. And you could also see that the Malian junta started to try to limit where the UN peacekeepers could actually observe what was happening, especially since there was a deployment of the Russian mercenaries, the Wagner group, at the end of 2021, beginning of 2022. So all of a sudden, the UN peacekeeping mission had to coexist with mercenaries on the ground, which of course is constraining their movements, but also not just in terms of practical terms, but also by the Malian junta telling them that you're not allowed to observe this. And particularly, there was one incident in 2022 where the Malian army, together with Wagner mercenaries, massacred over 500 civilians in Mora over 3 days. Mora is a village in the center of Mali, which the UN peacekeeping operations were not allowed to access, to actually observe that. So you could see that over the last 3 years then, MINUSMA got less and less space and less consent from the junta. And last year in 2023, the Malian transitional authorities asked MINUSMA to leave, which was kind of an unprecedented incident where you have an illegitimate government, an illegal government of a military coup leaders asking a UN peacekeeping operations to leave. So basically you have an illegal military junta telling a peacekeeping mission that you're leaving, which of course could create precedents in other cases. And the UN decided that they were going to go ahead with that. So the last troops left in the midst of renewed fighting in the north of Mali at the end of 2023. So that's the first example. The second example of waning consent is in the DRC, where we've seen a peacekeeping operations being deployed no less than 25 years, more or less. The first version of, because I think we can say that there are several versions of peace operations when it's been deployed over 2 decades. MONUC was deployed in the DRC in 1999, gradually grew to becoming one of the largest peace operations and most expensive one, to now being gradually being phased out under 2024 after there have been demonstrations, popular demonstrations against MONUSCO as it called, but also because the new government of Tshisekedi, who was re-elected last year. I'm doing like this because it was very irregular and corrupt elections again. has asked the UN peacekeeping mission to leave. And this time they are actually gradually withdrawing troops. Even though, again, conflict is resurging in the east of Congo. It has actually never stopped. So again, we can ask about the effectiveness, of course, of peacekeeping. But we've also seen, and that's another discussion, that in Mali, as soon as MINUSMA left, violence basically flared up again in the north of the country. But that's another discussion. So what we've seen is that in both the DRC and in Mali, over the past 2 years, whatever we can call about the governments or the authorities, we can talk about how legitimate they are or how much they represent the will of the population. They have kind of withdrawn their consent, and what we're seeing is that the UN peacekeeping had to leave. So if that is the first trend, the second trend is something that's kind of happened in parallel with these major UN peacekeeping operations, and that's the deployment of these regional so-called stabilisation forces, often with very robust counter-insurgency or counter-terrorist mandates. And I'm sure that John will talk more about this later, because he has done quite a lot of research on that. And we've seen these ad hoc coalitions popping up all over the continent during the past decade, bypassing the frameworks from the AU and from the UN that have been drawn up for these types of peace operations and peacekeeping missions, but drawing on the common culture that have been creating within these framework, and also the interoperability between the forces that also have been going through this framework, what John Karlsrud and If Rakers have called institutional exploitation. So that's the concept that you've been using to explain how in some ways these frameworks have been used, but then at the end they're bypassing them to create their own ad hoc coalitions. And I'm going to let you explain much more about that, John, because that's your field. I'm just going to give you two empirical examples, and I think that we're not going to speak about gender or female peacekeepers, but I think what we can observe in these sort of more robust stabilization counter-terrorist operations is that there is less room, of course, for female peacekeepers, because we know that female peacekeepers are rarely deployed to operations which are considered as more kinetic or more dangerous and so on. So that means that there is also less female peacekeepers or soldiers involved in these counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency operations. So two of these empirical examples of these are the MNJTF, the Multinational Joint Task Force, which has been deployed to the Lake Chad Basin to fight Boko Haram, and authorized by the AU since 2014. Very difficult to discuss whether there have been any clear result of this. We don't see much of what's happening around it, and it continues to do operations, but it's very, very, very obscure information distribution of what's happening with this one. But it is an ad hoc coalition that has an authorization from the AU, but it's not mandated from the AU. And then, of course, we have the G5 Sahel, which is basically imploded over the last 2-3 years. An initiative pushed by France, putting together 5 of the Sahel countries in this joint force, fighting terrorists across the Sahel region over the past 7 years now. I spoke to the general of the G5 Sahel force in 2021, and he said it's never been a G5. It's always been a G1, G2, maximum G3, because you never had all 5 of them together at any one point. But that's another topic. But this is another trend, of course, that you're putting together these ad hoc coalitions that kind of bypass the framework that they're supposed to follow. And the risk is, of course, that there are more human rights abuses, that there are less vetted personnel who take part of these missions, and that there is also more of national interest guiding them directly into it. But it's also faster deployment, and also means that you can go past the whole bureaucratic process involved in these major multilateral missions. And you also have more direct objectives, basically neutralizing, eliminating, or killing, let's say, terrorist groups or rebel groups. Often, again, neighboring countries putting together in these operations. And I'm going to leave it to Jonathan to continue with the third trend.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can everyone hear me? Great, okay, thanks Nina, and thanks Peter and colleagues for inviting us as well. It's been great so far. I'm looking forward to the discussions. So the third trend that we are focusing on is related to the previous one, of course, and you might call it forum shopping in relation to security operations. So forum shopping, we mean by that how different African states are taking up membership of different overlapping what are called regional economic communities, or RECs, so regional organizations, and they partly do that in to negotiate national or regional identity. If you think, for example, of the role of Tanzania, which is sort of halfway between southern and eastern Africa, but more importantly, in the context that we're talking about today, in order to pursue different policy goals in relation to peace operations. And one of the strongest examples of this in recent years is going back to Democratic Republic of Congo. And because of DRC's enormous size and also its geography as well, and kind of the heart of Africa, it's become a real paradigmatic example of this forum shopping behavior. So it's a member at the moment of 7 different regional organizations in Africa, as well, of course, as being a member of the AU. And the most recent one of these it joined was in 2022 of the Eastern African, or the East African community. And shortly after it joined the EAC, it asked the community to deploy kind of regional security force to Congo itself to kind of deal with various insurgencies happening, particularly in the east of the country. But after a while, it asked that mission to end, because it felt that the progress being made against rebel groups was not being particularly taken seriously. I'll use diplomatic language since we're on the record. And so they asked the mission to leave, and instead Congo went to the Southern African Development Community, SADC, to basically ask for a new, more offensive operation. And indeed, many of the troops that ended up in that operation were rehatted from MONUSCO anyway. So that's a good example of forum shopping by one particular country in recent years. But we've seen it in many other occasions, particularly in East Africa, where you have multiple different types of regional organisation, IGAD, as well as African Union as well. So forum shopping is a third trend that we think is worth thinking about and talking about, and the implications of it, because of course it hollows out the capacity of regional organizations as well, because they become more just a kind of vehicle of a particular policy rather than an embedded security agenda. The fourth trend we're going to talk about, or are talking about, in fact, is the increase in bilateral or bilateral stabilisation forces, so particularly around counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and these have been deployed to a number of kind of conflict hotspots in the continent from the demand of the host state. So this is where host states will say, we would like you to come in to assist us with a particular security challenge. So it's almost peacekeeping on demand, if you like. And Rwanda has been, we think, the most prominent example of this. It's been called by some the gendarme of Africa. And in recent years, it's seen troops by invitation being deployed to Mozambique, to Central African Republic, and to Benin as well. So we've seen 3,000 plus Rwandan soldiers in Mozambique since 2021, again following an invitation by the Mozambican government to try and deal with the jihadist insurgency. There's also been Rwandan soldiers in CAR, interestingly as both part of a UN mission and separate to that as well, as part of the Rwandan intervention. And of course in Benin as well, there's also been intervention by Rwanda at the invitation of the Beninois government. And I think one of the things that's quite interesting about this is, so one of the arguments we make in this book, which took a little bit of a while to come out, that's true, but like a fine wine, you have to let these things, what do you do with wine? It's not ferment, but anyway, age and get better, and age. Anyway, one of the arguments we made in the book was sort of, you have certain states in Africa whereby peacekeeping has become effectively embedded within the political economy and the politics of the state. So there may be some states that take part in peacekeeping as a sort of, an addendum or one of the many things that they do, but in some cases, Uganda, Rwanda, a few other cases, peacekeeping is actually a core part of foreign policy, of the management of budgets, all this sort of thing. And so it's interesting to think about, well, if we do see this gradual decline of multinational peacekeeping, then what are countries like Uganda or Rwanda going to do, instead? They can't just, bring all of those troops back home, and if it's now embedded in their economy. So this could potentially represent an interesting trajectory in future types of peace operations or security operations. And it's interesting as well because it then raises questions about, well, what are the reputations of some of these African armies? Because if you are the government inviting this force in, then you have to think, this can potentially be a competition around, what are seen as being the most professional or at least effective, which are not necessarily the same thing, security forces. And of course, another example of this bilateral move is the recent proposal by Kenya to send some of its troops into Haiti as part of a bilateral operation, which was, so as Nina was saying in relation to the AU, it's authorized by the UN Security Council, but it's not an official peacekeeping operation. And in fact, it's not even, it's a bit different to some of the other types of operations we've seen from African states, in that it's meant to go into Haiti and support the Haitian National Police to basically re-establish security, particularly in relation to combating gangs. So it's a much more kinetic mandate, as they say, than what you might expect from a typical peacekeeping operation. It'll be interesting to see how that develops. I was actually in Nairobi just before Christmas and spoke to various people about this mission, and it's an interesting development because historically Kenya has been involved in UN peacekeeping, but very much not involved in other types of bilateral types of mission. It got involved in Somalia through the African Union mission there in the 2010s, but that was really quite an unusual thing for Kenya to do foreign policy wise. So this is quite an interesting development. It's also been something that's been surrounded by quite a lot of legal obstacles as well. So there have been various blocks put on it in the Kenyan justice system. And from speaking to people in Kenya in December, it doesn't really seem like the Kenyans, let's say, have been adequately trained or prepared for this operation. So yeah, who knows what is going to happen with that one. And the final trend that we wanted to point to was the kind of drawdown, basically, of troop contributions from certain states due to internal reasons. So, a prominent recent example of that will be Ethiopia, which was the third largest contributor to UN peacekeeping back in 2020. If you know anything about Ethiopia, you'll know that they had a conflict in the north of Ethiopia between 2020 and 2022, and that led to a huge drawdown of Ethiopian troops from UN peacekeeping operations, perhaps as much as nearly 90% of their troops. So they went down to number 15 in the UN peacekeeping contribution rankings within 2 years. Another example, which is maybe slightly less dramatic, is South Africa, which, even though it had various reviews in the 1990s, which sort of suggested it should focus more on protecting the country's territorial integrity and domestic things, it still was quite committed to peacekeeping multilaterally during the 2000s and parts of the 2010s as well. But some of those missions have seen real strains being placed on the South African military, but also have been quite domestically unpopular as well, including with the South African population and successive governments as well. So we've seen a withdrawing of South African troops from places like CAR, for example, from the UNAU mission in Darfur. And that has really kind of coincided with a shift in priorities more generally for South Africa in terms of deploying troops generally just more to the surrounding region rather than the whole continent, but also a renewed focus on domestic security issues, particularly with the rise of political turmoil and xenophobic violence against immigrants, refugees, and so on and so forth. And with an election coming up later this year, we suspect that peacekeeping will not be a particularly significant priority for South Africa going forward. So to conclude, we're seeing quite a number of significant changes happening in parallel in relation to the African peace and security landscape, which we're arguing will reshape the way that peace and stabilization operations are happening, not only in Africa but also beyond, as we've seen potentially in the case of Haiti as well. And some of the characteristics of this would be ad hoc coalitions, which are often authorized by the UN or the AU, so they have a kind of degree of legitimacy, but they're not mandated, and therefore they're able to have that much more flexibility and adaptability, and not the same conditionalities, expectations, and scrutiny as you might get with mandated missions. They also tend to be missions which are more kinetic, more violent, more akin to counterinsurgency, and they often tend to be more tied directly to national and short-term interests of stabilization rather than long-term peace building. And I think one one thing we've been struggling with is, and some of the other speakers may also have thoughts on this, about is this part of is there a single explanation for this trajectory, or are there multiple things happening and multiple different regional explanations or global explanations we could think about? And I think finally, does it even, so kind of not quite along the same lines as abolishing peacekeeping as a thing, but does it still make sense to talk about peacekeeping at all in the context of these sorts of developments? Does it meaningful to talk about any of what we've talked about today as peacekeeping? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina and Jonathan, for that very interesting presentation. I want to open the floor for quick questions, 5 minutes. Anybody? Mike?
Thank you. One observation, piece of news that I learned about today, which is that the conflict in Sudan now involves Ukrainian forces. I was kind of surprised to hear that the Ukrainians have sent troops to Sudan. Interesting development, perhaps. Obviously, they're fighting against their known enemies, the Wagner group, who are also operating in Sudan. So the Ukrainian conflict now has an African dimension, which is kind of curious, even more than it was before. Mostly, my question is about Benin. What are the Rwandans doing in Benin?
Do you want to do that?
Yeah. Yeah. So what the Rwandans are doing in Benin, it's very difficult to say right now, because it's been said that they are deployed, but so far there hasn't been any evidence of them deploying. But there has been a bilateral agreement, haven't seen it, but between the Beninoise government or authorities and the Rwandans, that they will deploy counterinsurgency or counter-terrorist troops. Same as they did in Mozambique, but to fight in the north of Benin. But Rwandans on the ground, it's like Wagner. It's all very obscure information about it so far. But we're going there soon, so we're going to check whether they're.
Great.
And for Sudan, I think I'll just continue with that one, because I was just writing about it. But I think we see the continuation of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, in Africa, in many ways, with the Wagner group, or now the Africa Corps, and or being renamed as the Africa Corps. And then I think there is a logic to it, that Ukraine is then deploying their troops to fight Russian influence on another continent as well, in some ways. Like this is you can see it just going south, just as we are, and when I say we, I mean the Western troops have deployed significant security forces to the Sahel over the past decade to fight jihadist groups there. So I think you can see how armed conflict is moving, but with the same actors involved, and then becoming more complex.
I think it's also worth saying on Benin that there's actually quite a long-standing relationship between Rwanda and Benin, which hasn't been widely reported on. I remember when I was going back there in 2015, 2016, I was speaking to people in the president of Rwanda's office, and they were saying they had exchanges and these sorts of, relationships about, how in some respects trying to emulate the Rwanda model. That was more about governance and domestic policy, I suppose. But I think it's not necessarily something that's come out of nowhere. It's part of maybe a more long-standing relationship, which is now moving into the security sphere.
I think that for many African states that are seeing these counter or these insurgencies or terrorists, Rwandan forces are a bit seen as part of the solution to it. I think they have a reputation continentally of being fast, efficient, and especially since Mozambique, of being much more efficient, for example, than Wagner, that basically had to leave after 3 months of being deployed to Mozambique, because they got too many casualties. And had to withdraw. Like one of the embarrassing withdrawal of Wagner, and then Rwandans came in and were much more efficient. So that kind of increased their popularity as this counterinsurgency force that can be deployed around the African continent.
As you suggest, they're more robust, kinetic, and violent.
Yeah.
I think it also.
Yeah.
No.
which is what Jonathan was saying. Can we still call it peacekeeping? Because I think we're outside the realm of what we define as peacekeeping when we talk about this, but they are still asking for authorization from the organizations. And then we come back to John's concept of institutional exploitation. Like how long can you draw legitimacy from these multilateral organizations?
And I think it also, I think, Jonathan, you opened the question a little bit about what does it do to the troop contributors that they are going into these much more murky sort of waters of interventions.
Yeah.
And I think it's very much, I mean, we're doing a special issue actually on this very issue about how the troop contributors are also being shaped by intervening. But I think it's very clear from Marsha's presentation, it's very much about the intervention itself. Also here, it's very much about what's the people that are going into these territories, and then how does it shape the interventions. But there are so many ways that it sort of interacts with the troop contributors back home.
Yeah.
So definitely. I think maybe something for later. Yes, we are moving on. Andrew, are you ready? Thank you, both of you. Interesting. And here we are moving on and talking specifically about African-led peace support operations, talking about peacekeeping 3.5 generation. I'm not even sure that it's then peacekeeping anymore, but Andrew will be very clear on that when he's presenting now. But definitely we are moving into sort of some of the ways that it has transformed at least these types of interventions. And it leads nicely from Jonathan and Nina's presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today. Let me start by just giving you a brief roadmap of where my presentation is going to hopefully touch on. So the first aspect is going to look at some of the background of peacekeeping in Africa. Some of it's been touched on, but I'll not provide an alternative, but some other more wider frameworks. Second aspect, we'll look at the focus on the evolution of UN peacekeeping and how this emerges into, or should I say, evolves into a more nuanced understanding of African-led peace support operations. And then I'll move into some of the key observations, and then why I classify these as generation 3.5 peacekeeping, and some of the final points on the contradictions. So my starting point really here is about how African-led peace support operations were established, mostly in connection with the African peace and security architecture. And they were really deployed as an integrated capacity. And the idea being here, off the back of Rwanda and other challenges that the African continent was suffering with or faced, that it tried to, or its leadership tried to respond in a different manner. So from the early 2000s to 2010s, you see a growing disillusionment, with what I would say liberal peace building efforts, oftentimes post-conflict efforts that actually didn't work. And so Mbeki from South Africa would be the classic example where he was calling for more of a robust approach from the international community, but wasn't getting that. And in essence, Africa had to look inwards at itself to say, what do we need and how do we move things forward? Against this backdrop, you also have a shift in traditional conflicts internally. So no longer the sort of traditional conflicts that you see or emerged. And in addition to that, you then see the emergence of Islamic jihadists, the war on terror, for those of you who remember that, and that narrative and how that played also into this. And in some cases, this intervened and changed, I would argue, the conflict dynamics on the ground in the African continent. This changed the nature of warfare, but also how the UN would respond to peacekeeping as well. But also, additionally, it also meant to a certain extent that Western states started to subcontract peacekeeping, as it were, to African states. In this case, the African entities, the African Union, Regional Economic Communities, and RECs, as part of their support towards the APSA. So if you think of that backdrop and that framework, I, in one of my papers called Generation 3.5 Peacekeeping, tried to frame this within Paul Williams and Co.'s thinking. And here they really look at three major waves. First, how peacekeeping evolved, and you have this idea of conflict resolution, which was really about added collective security, should I say, grounded in some Western utopia, but also this idea of humanitarian preoccupation. Second wave, which is really about the inception of conflict resolution tools, in this case peacekeeping, became a critical element to this, and this idea of attempts to reconstitute, as it were, or organizing principles. And then this final wave, which is really the events of Rwanda and Bosnia, saying, actually, we need to intervene more. We need to do more, capture what is happening. Here you're looking at human rights, focuses distribution on humanitarian aid, protection of civilians, emerges this growing Western concept as well, but also within the AU as well. And this, for the most part, when it came to the idea of peacekeeping, particularly in Africa, meant that it was grounded and rooted in international politics. The idea of what was taking place theoretically, but also in terms of the use of force being used as this idea of dealing with these challenges as well. And when I say the use of force, I mean where there is peace to be kept in the UN's concept. And I'll come to those differences in a second. So, sure, can you hear me now? Okay, brilliant. So we have three sort of, well, in the literature, there's 4 generations of peacekeeping. The first really captures from 1948 to 1979, and that looks at a move away from limited efforts to maintain peace. And this you see here with the focus on UN Truce Supervision Organization in 1948, and also the Israel and Egypt Sinai conflict and challenges there. This then leads us to the second generation of peacekeeping, which is the changes in the nature and condition of conflict. So during this period, you see a lot of II scholars talk about this idea of new wars. And in addition to this, you have the charter of conflict reflecting interstate or internal conflict dynamics as well. But also, as I mentioned before, you have this idea of providing humanitarian aid, filling in the gap where it's needed. And this was slightly different because most of these mandates or these missions were really pivoted on Chapter 6, which was different from where we are now with Chapter 7 mandates. So we, in essence, witnessed a more multidimensional feature slowly creeping into these missions as time goes on. And this really is from the 1980s to the early 1990s, and then you see notable figures like Boutros Ghali and Kofi Annan as well in those areas. But also what you see from a theoretical perspective is, I would argue, 6 key observations. First is within missions, they took place within the context of ongoing violence. Second was this idea of new wars. The third was this idea of new civilian tasks and mandates within missions as well. The fourth being the increased number of humanitarian actors within complex emergencies. 5, the shifts in their mandates, constantly changing and constantly evolving. And the 6th was the gaps in this relationship between the means and the ends. So how do these states or these missions achieve these ends? By what means? And how do they end? And so you see this in particular with the UN mission in Somalia, the first 2 missions. The US has led Unified Task Force 1992 to 1993. But again, it reflects this idea of human rights monitoring, training to the global south as well, and this idea of participation. However, this expansion within UN peacekeeping created new problems. And I know Peter's research on Ghana covers some of this aspect as well. But it created, in many ways, this idea of the shopping tree, or should I say, this long list of things that you had to do, but with very limited resources. So then the third generation, which is pretty much bordering where we are now. Some say we're on the 4th, but I sort of sit with the 3rd. And this really focuses on the interchangeable terms of peace operations and peace enforcement. And I'll just let that sit with you for a moment. Peace operations versus peace enforcement, because this is key to the next part of the presentation. And what you see here is a focus really on this aspect of the permission of use of force, enforcement mandates. The previous speakers have spoken about those cases, the idea of better human rights protection of human civilians, more robust UN peacekeeping, so MONUSCO being that example that has been used here, and then mandates changes from peacekeeping to peace enforcement. But all of this creates new problems. Because they have to shift from their chapter 6 to chapter 7, and runs into difficulties, particularly around impartiality and whatnot. Sorry. Well, what is interesting about this period is also where you see an increased capacity from the African Union, in this case, the transition really for me of what I call the phases of what African-led peace support operations has gone through. So phase 1 for the African-led peace support operations really was about this idea of African states expanding their participation in UN peacekeeping and deployment of African-led peace support operations by REX. You see the AU eventually also deploying in this period as well. But also the sort of pinnacle moment of this was really from the transition of the OAU to the AU. And that transition here, for me, is where you start to see a new type of mission, really trying to respond to the on-the-ground realities. And so, contrary to systematic norms or principles of non-interference, here you see more coercion being used to deal with the situation on the ground. Phase 2 sort of emphasizes more of this, and here you see more of the deployments from REX, in this case ECOMOG from West Africa. You see them deployed in Liberia and Sierra Leone. We also see interventions under the UN, as I said, from peacekeeping to peace enforcement. But also largely you see this idea of, or the launch or concept of the African Standby Force. And this is, if you think of the last presentations and the maps of the African continent and the various coalitions, that's really what it's trying to point to. So in this case, you have ECOWAS in the West African region who deploys to Liberia and Sierra Leone. More recently, you have SADC and its mission as part of SAMIN to Mozambique. And these are REC types, and I'll get into some of the differences in a second. And then the third phase, which the previous speakers also mentioned, but also slightly divert away from their own conceptual understanding of that, is this idea of ad hoc security initiatives. And that we've seen in the last 10 decades. And again, this is really rooted in this idea of peacekeeping capacities by missions such as Amazon would be, I think, the classic example here, designed to a large extent and focus on stabilizing the environment and the states, which differ from where the UN is. But also their peace enforcement aspects are really trying to deal with something in the short term. They're not designed to be long-term multidimensional, even though they do allow for the capacity. And that's important because what it does mean is that they are an addition to all of the other stuff that has come in the past, particularly when it comes to African-led peace support operations. So if you think of the example being the AU and its deployment to Somalia, or the AU AFMISMA, or ECOMOG, these are add-ons to where we are now. So they're, in essence, they shouldn't be seen as, in my view, coalitions, and I know John will get into that later, but more security initiatives. And what they are designed to do is to deal with, as it were, not the root causes, but the manifestations of what we see now. In essence, deal with insurgencies, hand over to the state, but create stable environments. And that is very clear from their mandates, because their mandates, unlike the UN, don't adjust as frequently as they do in the UN's cases. So what are some of the key observations that we can note? Again, first being African-led peace support operations, or a range, and you can argue there's three. In the paper I say there's three, but argument is also a fourth one, which is this idea of bilateral. But the first being AU-led peace support operation, second one being REX-led missions, and then the third being this idea of coalition of states or coalition of the willing, which we dub in our article ad hoc security initiatives. Some other observations, and I'll give you 8 key points which are crucial to how the way in which I framed them in the paper. First, while the doctrine of African-led peace support operations is multidimensional in nature, the current categorizations of their mandates do not have enhanced civilian task, and that's, I think, pointed out by the previous speaker. Second, unlike UN peacekeeping, where you have peace-building features, African-led peace support operations deploy stabilization operations, oftentimes to stabilize regions, areas, as part of a strategy, and an essential part or departure from the previous logic of peace operations. Third, African-led peace support operations are not designed to engage in nation building, which is, again, very different from the way in which the UN does its aspects. So they're context specific. They're not really off the back of this idea of liberal democracies or liberal peace building. Really, they're African centric, and I would argue are rooted in some of the experiences from the African continent that have evolved to where we are now. Fourth, an increasing number of operations carried out by regional organizations oftentimes have endorsement from the UN Security Council, or in other cases from the African Union Peace and Security Council as well. A fifth aspect here is that the mandates are limited and aim to restore peaceful contexts, and they involve heightened use of force. 6, short-term focus, as I mentioned. 7, they did not seek to actively resolve the root causes of conflict, and that's crucial for me, because again, symptoms. And then the last aspect really, and for me an important part, is operations engage in robust interventions outside the UN doctrine, which partially aligns with the principles of peacekeeping, defense of the mandate in particular. So what does that mean for Generation 3.5 peacekeeping, in this case African-led peace support operations? First, what we have seen and observed from this is that there's been an increase in African capacity and agency and willingness to deal with insecurity, partly because the troops are the first ones to respond, as opposed to waiting for the UN to mandate something. The Security Council to go through the whole entire bureaucratic process. They're there, they deploy, they deal with insecurity. Second, African-led peace support operations have impacted African armies, increased their deployment, but also they've enabled them to gain new expertise. But also this has resulted in heavy military responses to insecurity as well. Third, African TCCs are influencing not only the types of operations, but also the tempo and the tactics used during these operations. Fourth, African entities have increased capacity and I would argue legitimacy to substitute the UN as a provider of security in particular contexts. Not in all contexts, but in particular contexts, they're able to do that. 5, changing nature of conflict also means that even though the UN might be mandated, oftentimes these African forces are the first responders, so they oftentimes are rehatted under the UN. And there's other examples of where that's happened. 7th, which is really about this idea and challenge, I think, that we're seeing emerge, which is that you see these deployments oftentimes coming from strong leaderships, so either strong democratic leaders or in other cases really strong authoritarian leaders. And here you see different types of forces being deployed. Chad being one, and the examples that it uses and the way in which it deploys to the field for remote areas, versus Ghana, democratic state, but can't do that sort of type of peacekeeping. And so you see different emergence or different types of deployments emerging from different types. And I think here is where one side is a concern for me, because what are they doing long term? How do they mix with internal challenges and politics? Versus the other one, which is rooted in UN peacekeeping and other traditional UN aspects and principles, but isn't necessarily equipped to deal with some of the emerging challenges that are existing on the continent. So what are some of the key summaries here? As I mentioned, African-led PSOs have the same evolutionary path as UN peacekeeping, but they reflect, in my view, a growing shift in division of labor. In the UN context, African peace support operations are framed as peace enforcement missions with connotations, as they say, of stabilization. But these operations are a mix of regional actors, means that they're not precisely fourth, but sit in between. So states with no option, oftentimes waiting for the RECs to respond, deal or try to deal with these insecurities by deploying African-led peace support operations as the first response to the insecurity. Thus, for me, and I think for growing literature, we are seeing that it demonstrates not precisely a generation four, but a generation in between, because they lack and this idea of multi-dimensional capacities, even though they do allow for that. And finally, just to sort of bring my presentation to an end, some of the contradictions on or of African-led peace support operation, and there are, I think, 9 for me. Sorry about the long numbers. First, they struggle with integrated political governance and security and socioeconomic development dimensions. So where the UN will do large peacekeeping and have various different officers, UNDP and whatnot, these missions don't have that, and oftentimes when they do have that, it often takes several years for them to do that. Salmon is more of the recent example where they have downgraded from scenario 6 to 5 to try and adjust for that, and now seeking support from the AU or have got support. Second, while peace support operations are often deployed at record speed, their response are largely military, lacking in the civilian dimension, but also not being able to deal with the root causes of insecurity. And that's why I think it's important to look at them as security initiatives as opposed to coalition of the willing, i.e. something like the Lake Chad Basin Commission. Third, African-led peace support operations have diluted this idea of people-centric and civilian governance, narrowly focusing on hearts and minds, hold, clear and build, and other strategies. Again, similar to what the previous speakers have spoken about as well. But they're also, fourth, become hybrid fixers of ongoing challenges, particularly within countries. And you see that with Kenya and Charco, within Somalia and other examples that have been used over the years, where they play into the economies or the local economies and create other additional challenges as well. Fifth, the evolution or the range of PSOs means that oftentimes you end up with particular forces. In this case, I think it's something like 7 or 8 forces from the African continent out of 55, Burundi, Uganda, Rwanda, Ghana, being always the particular ones that are deployed. And so there is an issue here where if it's only these technically 3 types of forces being deployed, what is the long-term impact of their deployment on the countries, but also more broadly when they go home? And that leads me really to the 6th point, which is the increased use of violence when they get back home, during protests, during crises as well, how they're used in conjunction with the police. Again, here there is a challenge in terms of how we look at them as well. The 7th point is really about external funding. While they've been able to deploy as first responders, they've always relied on external funding. And here, outside of salmon, that is the only mission. And I see Peter, and my last...
No, I'm just standing up.
And my last point really, which is they carry with them significant perception that non-violent methods have not achieved the desired outcome. And here what I mean is we're not really tapped into the idea of mediation, we're not tapped into this idea of peacemaking or peace building. And this stuff has gone really from the African continent. And for me, while again they deal with an initial problem, which is the insecurity, there is a need to build up the other side of that capacity, mediation, support, not just election observations, but more integrated approaches. And here, one of the next papers that I've been working on tries to look at this idea of how the AU and other entities frame this idea of stabilisation, a more broader sense, as opposed to more security focused. And I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Really interesting, I think, actually. And I think I don't think that you actually sort of resuscitated peacekeeping. You told us about new forms of interventions and coalitions that are emerging on the African continent. Obviously, sort of drawing on the experiences from peacekeeping, but also drawing on national domestic politics, histories relationships between the civilians and militaries. I mean, Ghana is a good example of that, which we won't get into now. But just so thank you very much for that. Very interesting. I want to open the floor to a few questions to Andrew, and then we'll take a break. Unless you want a break, and then we'll. So, any questions? Nina? Nina has a microphone.
I have a microphone. Yes, thank you for an interesting presentation. I had two questions. The first one was, I don't understand the difference between the security initiative and the ad hoc coalitions. So why is the MNJTF, for example, why don't you see that as an ad hoc or coalition of the willing? And what is the difference then with the security initiative? And then the second one was, in what context would these missions have more legitimacy and be more people-centered? Because as you just said, they use violence to a much greater extent. And many of these forces have used violence against civilians outside of whatever mandate they had. So yeah, those were my two questions.
Just to repeat the last question for me.
Yes, so you said that they were people-centered?
No.
Oh, not people-centered, but that they had more legitimacy in some instances, and then, for example, UN or AU missions. So I was wondering, in what context would that be the case?
So on the question of ad hoc security initiatives or coalitions versus ad hoc security initiatives versus ad hoc coalitions. So without looking at my boss, this is his area, but the way I understand security initiatives are pacts between various states. So if you look at, for example, the Accra initiative, theoretically speaking, they are a security initiative because they've come together between the cross-border areas to discuss about how they deploy within that area. That is similar to how the multinational joint task force emerged. And that is similar to the G5 Sahel, but also the LRA deployment that was done across the border as well, in East Africa. The reason why I see them distinctly different is because the multinational joint task force is a security initiative that works under a regional mechanism, which is the Lake Chad Basin Commission. Its head of mission, not force commander, but head of mission, is the Lake Chad Basin Commission. So for me, there is a distinction between the level at which it operates and it reports back to. And that for me is different, for example, to a coalition, which is a mechanism that the AU recognizes. So even though the AU recognizes the multinational joint task force, it recognizes it within the framework of the Lake Chad Basin Commission. So for me, that distinction is very clear. It's a force designed to deal with insecurity within its borders, but also crossover. It's not designed to do the multi-dimensional aspects or even to do anything like peace building. It's not designed to that. So for me, it's a security initiative. That's sort of where I see it. Versus the traditional coalitions, which I'm sure John will talk about, which have different aspects that might have development in there. So, for example, would be IGAD, ECOWAS. Those for me would be traditional coalitions that have emerged over the years. They're RECs, but what I mean is they've emerged to become defined within RECs within the APSA. But their original idea was they were coalitions. Before there was RECs, ECOWAS existed. This idea of development and whatnot. IGAD was really about this idea of agriculture and development within the East African regions. That is conceptually different for me than it is with a RECs, because again, they have evolved to become RECs as part of the APSA. So for me, I make that distinction because the multinational joint task force is a security initiative. The Accra initiative is a security initiative. It doesn't try to do development, where the Lake Chad Basin Commission does try to do that. Yeah, that's its role. That's why it has the RSS, and that's why there's no 9 pillars now, potentially 10, that it's working towards. On the legitimacy question, I'm trying to remember if I got this right. So why do I see them as legitimate? Is that in essence because, one, they're on the ground first. They're able to respond, oftentimes when the wider RECs haven't been able to. And so in the face of people or the communities, what they see, particularly you see this now over the years, not necessarily at the beginning, but over the years, is that they've recognized the legitimacy of their multinational joint task force because of some of the work that they've done over the years. So for me, that legitimacy is there partly because they're the first responder, partly because they're being seen as actively dealing with the situation. Now, we can argue the nuance of G5 Sahel, and that's fair. That's probably the example that you're thinking of, and the LRA. But again, conceptually, if you speak to people on the ground, people are recognizing the value of the multinational joint task force and its support towards the regional stabilization strategy. So that's where, for me, the legitimacy aspect comes, because you are seen as it were an African, which is the other aspect, who is trying to work towards helping these people. Now, there's some nuances about what that looks like, because you might have different levels, as you know. But again, that I think is very different from I fly in from the UK, I come in, this is how you do things, you should do it this way, because this is how we do things back home. And I think that in itself creates another dynamics, which I think the UN is still trying to largely perpetuate. When I was at the UN, I still see that now. I mean, we were in Abyei and we've got a report coming out. We still see that same sort of mindset. We know how to do things, we're telling you what to do. And I think there needs to be a draw away from that to more, again, regional dynamics, because I think it reflects those states and their interests. One, you could argue it can go a bit too far, but the other aspect is actually it means that these states are dealing with the issue on their own, which is better than having someone fly in telling you what to do. And I think that's largely where we see the French example in Francophone Africa, which has absolutely gone wrong. Yeah, but I mean, this is the argument that I had with Jon. I think the Wagner thing is overblown. Wagner's there. I'm not disputing that, but let's be honest. The French have been there and done more systematic issues, or more systematic damage to the African continent than any of those actors. And I can say that as a sort of Ghanaian British, if I'm okay to that, and even the UK.
Whatever you want to be, Andrew.
But what I'm trying to draw your attention to is there is nobody that anyone can stand there and say, well, you wouldn't expect that to happen. If your economy is tied to the French, which is then tied to the euro, of course you'd feel that way. If you see your resources constantly drained by France and you see nothing but there, and yet still your president is flying business class back to France and being greeted, you would feel a particular way. And I think what the difference we're seeing is something that has been hijacked by the regime or the junta, which is legitimate in terms of people's differences or people's discontent with what's going on in the country. I think you can't ignore that.
I also think, yeah.
Wagner for me is just a flower of many other aspects. But if you look at, I mean, there's that book on Chad Jonathan, what's Jonathan's name? But he's written about French intervention.
Powell.
Yeah, Jonathan Powell. French intervention in Chad. Constantly. But what I'm trying to draw your attention is that constant intervention. I mean, this Wagner thing for me, 18,000 estimated numbers. There's not 18,000 Wagner troops in Africa. There's not. So the majority of them are probably in Ukraine, if anything, or across the border and whatnot. So that influence of Wagner in Africa, for me, is way overblown. You're talking about maybe 5, 6, if anything, 10, and there's 55 African states. Is it Wagner in Africa?
But
no, but you talked about somebody flying in, though.
No, but what I'm saying to you is it's flying into a country and controlling the way things are done and telling you what to do.
But they're former colonial powers. I mean, that is becoming more and more clear, I think. If you look, for instance, take Kwesi, when you talk about the French in West Africa, it cannot be said out loud in many contexts because people are pissed at, and it's very easy to look at the French and the Brits as representing a certain history of acting in the region that Russia doesn't do. I mean, you know, so...
There is that aspect, but also I think, like I said, it's the arrogance that comes with it.
Yeah, but the arrogance comes with a history.
No, yes, no, of course. But I think that's
the patience with the Brits coming in, the French coming in, is very limited. I think in the
context specific, yeah, but yeah,
in West Africa. Sorry.
No. It's fine. I mean, look, I could be more controversial. I'm trying to be diplomatic up here as well about this because I want to
then save me and you, no, not you, just me, from this conversation, just to say that now we take a small break and we have, as I said, saving the best for last. After the break, with his John. Don't let me down, John. But please go and take a coffee, talk to the speakers, come back at 4. These ad hoc coalitions a lot this afternoon. And now we have one of the people who knows the most about these ad hoc coalitions, or at least has written extensively on them, who will do a presentation. It's John Karlsrud, research professor at NUPI. So, John, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well? It's okay? No?
Is it on?
It is on. So maybe I should.
You want mine?
Try it more like this. Is this better? Yeah. I just don't want to have this screeching in your ears. But this is okay. Good. I'll talk a little bit about ad hoc coalitions, just to continue the saga, and what I think about and the people I work with in some of the projects that I'm working on the future of peacekeeping. So this is a brief overview of my presentation. I won't bore you too much with that. Okay, so background, we talked a lot about it already. A lot of the speakers have touched on different aspects of this. We know there is increasing geopolitical tensions. We know there is increasing insecurity, partially as a consequence of these geopolitical tensions on increased energy prices, food prices, and so forth. And I would at least argue that ad hoc coalitions are dominating the picture in Africa, but we also now see the at least, well, should we say, tentative multinational security support mission to Haiti. It's still not there, although there is much work to try to put it there. We also have heard about other alternatives, like the Africa Corps, formerly known as Wagner Group, and African states. This is kind of recent. African states have succeeded now, just before Christmas, to pass a UN Security Council resolution on financing. What does this kind of these different factors? How do they play into the picture on the ground? So we have a project on ad hoc coalitions, and it's been running now for 2-3 years. We try to define them, and we define them as organizational arrangements with a task-specific mandate established on short notice for a limited time frame. Of course, on peace operations in general, there has been much focus on international governmental organizations like the UN, the AU, NATO, or the EU. But the current geopolitical environment draws attention to how they are contested. And there hasn't been much attention to how we see alternative forms of cooperation on the ground in various areas. We have multi-stakeholder initiatives. So there's a kind of an increasing informalization of international cooperation, moving away from IGOs to other forms. So ad hoc coalitions is one of those forms of cooperation, we would argue. We could also see philanthropists like Gates having a very strong influence on how the COVID epidemic was handled. So this is just one example, but we want to draw some attention to it. Coalitions, AHCs, are very importantly, it's about purpose, speed, and time frame. So a particular purpose, usually a short time frame, but this could be extended over time. Sometimes, when the troops are on the ground, they tend to stay there. But initially, usually a very short time frame. And importantly, try to put troops on the ground fast. Yeah, we have a data set under review. Now, we made a data set, and it's under review at the moment, so we hope that this is going to be a publication quite soon. But we have then tried to trace ad hoc coalitions from after the Second World War until today. And what we see is This is the red line is ad hoc coalitions, so this is not a new phenomenon, but it grew significantly, particularly in the 2000s, and now it's kind of flatlined a little bit lower, but the number of states that participate in those coalitions is increasing, and it's really large. This is particularly, I mean, there's a couple of really big coalitions. So the coalition against ISIS, help me, Daesh, yeah, that's the name, had a lot of member states. So that drew up the numbers quite a lot, just to tell you. It's a bit of an anomaly in the numbers there. But it's not a new phenomenon. Let's see, yeah. We also see them, like I said, in other policy areas. In global health, we saw the ACT accelerator that was particularly important to solve the COVID-19 crisis. Okay, so the kind of the positive side of coalitions are clear. They're task-specific mandate, short notice activation, usually just for a limited period of time. They make it this kind of form of cooperation, an attractive governance option for states that wants to really put their resources together on short notice to solve a collective crisis. Is a logical and effective crisis response tool. And particularly when we see that organizations face gridlock and delay. So there's clear reasons why we see more and more ad hoc coalitions. However, we should also be aware that it's also quite a few challenges linked to coalitions, these type of coalitions. They tend to treat symptoms rather than causes. There is often limited strategic planning. And from the experiences on the ground, we know, for example, the G5 Sahel, I don't know how to put this in diplomatic terms, but they were able, the troops that were involved in the G5 Sahel were able to kill more civilians than the terrorists were. Human Rights Watch. So I don't know how you can kind of define success in such situations. The same with MNJTF has had quite a record of human rights abuses and also documented well. So they also often operate with unclear legal and political mandates, and that raises concerns about their accountability. Non-binding political declarations allow for more flexibility, yet they also come with ambiguity about legal authority and political oversight. I think importantly, as also was mentioned by Jonathan and Nina, for example, Samim in northern Mozambique, so intentedly, it did not ask for a mandate from the African Union, because that would tie them under African Union command and control. Instead, after they had started the mission, they asked for authorization, and they didn't. They got an authorization from the Peace and Security Council, which opened the money from the EU. Very important, but they didn't have to report very much, and they do not report very much. The EU has been actually quite frustrated because they don't get much reporting from the mission, neither there or the East African Commission mission in the Eastern Congo when that was deployed. These were both either recognized or endorsed, but they did not really provide much information on what was going on the ground. The recognition or endorsement, both are okay, opens for, or there are 4 forms, we could go into that. There's mandate you can get from the AU, you can get an authorization, a recognition, or an endorsement. Only the mandate makes it a full AU PSO. The other 3 forms of engagement with a ad hoc coalition, sorry, it's probably my daughter who's calling me, are opening the door for EU financing, but there's not many strings attached in terms of human rights reporting and those kind of things. And that's kind of important for what we come to next. So at the moment we see a possible operation in Somalia. At the moment, there is ATMIS, the African Union operation, and it's being scaled down, drawn down quite in stages. And there's much talk about what should succeed ATMIS in Somalia. We talked a little bit earlier in the previous presentations about Kenya and the mission to Haiti. And as you might know, it came about after Lloyd Austin was in Kenya in September last year, and there was a defense agreement signed between the US and Kenya. The rumor is that a potential alternative to AU operation in Somalia is a Kenyan-led coalition, also probably under the same defense agreement. We also see, of course, we talked about the MNJTF, the G5 Sahel, Samim. Now SADC, and that was also mentioned, SADC has replaced the Eastern African Commission in Eastern Congo and Haiti. We're going to come back to it, but now let me talk a little bit about the UN. So the current Secretary General, he isn't too keen on UN peacekeeping, unfortunately. That's also quite a challenge for those who are more positive to peacekeeping. And that is it's not easy to read out of the documents that comes out of the UN at the moment, but the UN released a document called the New Agenda for Peace last summer, and just now the drafting the outcome document for the Summit of the Future is going to come out this autumn. It's called the Pact for the Future. Neither gives peacekeeping much of a big role. It talk about reform, review, words that kind of don't look very good. And when you talk with people inside the organization, they are on a scale from worried to very dystopic. One person I talked with said, well, basically this Secretary General, he's going to do away with the whole of peacekeeping and special political missions too. He don't believe in them. He doesn't believe in them. I mentioned this resolution in this December 2024 about financing of African peace operations. Now, that was seen as a win, I think, for African states and for the African Union. And perhaps, but it stipulates in the council resolution. This is important because it's hard to change that resolution. It was passed in the last minute, squeaked through the door, and I don't think it's going to be a renegotiation on it. So it stipulates that it has to be mandated operations, not endorsed, not recognized, not authorized, under the direct command and control of the AU. Now, people that I talk with in the AU, they want to adapt the ASF doctrine to try to include ad hoc coalitions, that they can also be seen as AU-led operations. I don't think it's that easy. I'm very interested to hear Andrew's comments on that, because he's supporting the African Union on that particular effort. Also, there's a kind of a cost to the resolution, because if funding UN-assessed contributions, UN funding is used to support African peace support operations or coalitions, there are particularly, and the human rights regime in particularly was mentioned again and again in the resolution. So there are financial, operational, and human rights reporting requirements in that resolution that haven't been operationalized, but they are significant. So this is going to basically result in a significant transaction costs for both the UN and in particular the AU. So consequences for UN rules and regulations. So they say that we need to adapt to a high tempo, kinetic type of operations. When I talk with people in New York, they say, well, we know that UN peacekeeping principles they don't apply, but we can't change them. That's a General Assembly process. It's not possible. So we're just going to continue to do what we have done, basically since Congo, Mali, and operate in two different worlds at the same time. So we have the principles here, and we just pretend that we are following them, and then we do something else. But for the AU, on talking about transaction costs, they need to develop contingent-owned equipment and personnel manuals. The UN need to adjust theirs, because these manuals, and sorry to be so technical, but this is quite interesting. The UN peacekeeping manuals, they are set up to reimburse states for their expenses and for attrition and wear of equipment in peacekeeping, not in robust high tempo kinetic environments. So actually there is a disincentive in those manuals to engage in confrontation with someone, because then you won't be reimbursed, or not completely, but here I think the force commander, the former force commander, can give me some detail. Yeah, it's at least there is a strong disincentive to engage in robust operations in the current regime, so to speak. So it doesn't fit. They need to actually adjust them, and again that's a very difficult process. So in short, large normative questions as well as administrative procedures that needs to be addressed if this at all should come to kind of operationalization, which I am hesitant to whether actually will happen. So yeah, will it happen? Not sure. Way forward. This I think is the UN is already in many different areas in global governance, seeking a more supportive role. The UN, after the Second World War and most of our lives, the UN has been an arena where we meet, where states meet up and agree on solutions, and then use the tools available to the UN or others to solve them. I think the world has changed over the last couple of decades. It's now the G7, the G20, the BRICS. They are tasking organizations, and the UN has become one of those who picks up tasks and are very eager to show that they're relevant to other platforms, more narrow platforms, clubs. I think on the resolution, I think the AU may have won the battle, but I'm not sure they won the war. Time will show. And structural conditions point to more coalitions, more limited forms of cooperation, and less multilateralism, I think, whether that's the UN or the AU. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So I think we can conclude that peacekeeping as we knew it is dead. After these 4 presentations, at least it's changed so significantly in form that we need to talk about it in other terms, unless we pretend like the UN in New York that we still have the same principles, we just don't follow them. So thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. I think I will invite everybody to the floor to stand up here with us, and then I'll invite first some questions for John from the audience. And we have like 40 minutes for Q&A, so plenty of time to answer all your burning questions. You want me to? Okay. Great.
Thank you.
Any questions? I'll multitask while I see people. Louisa, you have a I can see. Hey, Louisa, stop that. Come on.
I can have a question if you. Yeah, no, it's because I found it very interesting how you put the ad hoc coalitions in the same category as sort of multi-stakeholderism and all the other informality and ad hocisms that we have out there. But I was just curious as to, because you mentioned the health area is one where we see a lot of multi-stakeholderism, and we have a lot of non-state actors also playing an important role. And I was just curious as to whether you see the same thing happening in the field of security, or whether we are there moving backwards in a way towards a much more state-centric world where it's only the state actors and not civil society, like all the multi-stakeholders we have, private companies, gates, big cities, unions, religious communities, all the non-state actors that we were very interested in not that long ago in the field of security. But we don't hear that much about them anymore, except as terrorists and rebels. So just a question on that. Thank you.
No, I think you're right. So for security, of course, it's more state-centric before and now, in a way. And with the kind of the liberal regime, there was a lot of other actors that were involved in advising and so forth. And I think my PhD was based on that, basically. But I think what my overall argument is that we move to more towards a more informal way of global governance, and that I still think holds also for security. Yeah. Thank you.
Do you want to say something, or Nina? You want to? No? No. Yes. Okay. So we have a question. You have a question. You have a question?
No, but I'll formulate it first.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. This might be a question that might interest all of the speakers here. I was just wondering, after having listened especially to the last, but also the previous presentations, are we moving into a situation where nobody really believes that something desirable will come out of whatever form the future peace missions will have? Is it more ritual? Let's say we have to do something about this nasty situation going on somewhere, so we will send some people in, we'll pay for it if we look upon it from a, let's say, a northern perspective, northern half perspective, or is it just sort of an empty ceremony we are performing now, or what would be the rationale? I don't know if anyone has a comment on that.
Yes, John.
Yeah, I can start. So I think what you saw in Mozambique, I don't know very much about the operation, but it seemed successful. But with little oversight, I don't have any insight to how that operation was conducted. Maybe Andrew can help me. And the kind of the robustness, or how many civilians, if you want to say that in a different way, how many civilians the Rwandans and the others killed in the process. So I think, and many have touched on this already, we're moving towards a regime where there's less time or interest in human rights, in kind of the fate of those who are in minority in a country, which I think is a sad thing. This kind of the lesson that always has been very up and front and center for UN peacekeeping is that the primacy of the political. Now I think the political is out the window. Very often it's just let's just roll over them and see what happens. Yeah.
Andrew, do you want to?
I mean, for the Mozambique example, I think what we see from the data is a clear effort that, to a large extent, worked for the first probably 9 months to a year. So we see the Rwandans deploy, push the terrorists down towards the southern part. SADC then deploys, then is trying to deal with all of these terrorists in the south parts, has had some troubles. So has it been largely successful? You could argue to a certain degree, yes. It's diffused the initial challenge. The challenge, as I mentioned before, becomes when it's trying to then scale up to do the other stuff, which is the more multidimensional aspect. So recognition that the state forces are weak. How do we engage better? How do we do things like development in the area? Because that's partly the reasons why terrorists and whatnot have emerged. And there is where particularly African security initiatives have struggled, or in this case, SADC's mission of salmon in that region. And that's where I think the challenge has come. What is interesting is, while to a certain degree, most of these operations are deployed, and as John and others have said, have circumvented the AU. Oftentimes after a year they do come back, and not just for money and whatnot, but they do partly because their donors push them to implement or put in place structures that link back to Western, or should I say human security, because the African Union's context, it says human security as opposed to human rights and whatnot. So, for example, you look at the Multinational Joint Task Force, it has within it an AU cell that reports on the functions and activities of the Multinational Joint Task Force. Now that information is there. It's not necessarily publicly available on the website, but it's there. And so what I'm trying to say is, over time, eventually, they do come back. I think the challenge has been in contexts like Somalia, where there is a direct impact maybe on the states that deploy, and I'm thinking here of Uganda or Burundi, and how that looks back home when several number or hundreds of troops die. And I think that has led to Amazon taking the approach that it has taken. But again, the data is there, and we do know the data is available. I think Paul Williams has done stuff on the number of people dead and troops, but also on the civilian side as well. So there is stuff there. One quick point, if I may. So on the ad hoc security initiatives, actually the AU has clarified where they sit within the wider peace support operations within its doctrine. So while people still see it sitting outside of the AU has made it very clear within its doctrine that ASIs are to be included within that. So it has established it as part of the more broader APSA work as well.
I think
so counter question then is, if it's established now, I think that's a draft document. Has it passed? This is the draft.
As far as my understanding is, it has gone through. Yeah.
The new African Standby Force doctrine. Yeah?
No. It's the Peace Support Operations doctrine.
Okay.
Not the ASF. The ASF is now going through reconceptualization.
Okay.
Now.
But it still doesn't put ASIs, or what you want to call them, coalitions, under command and control, and they're not mandated. No. They just recognized.
Yeah.
Nina? You want to say something? You don't
No,
have to.
I guess I came back to the same question that I had for Andrew to John then. So for you, ad hoc security coalitions are basically the same as we define it from the beginning, with G5 Sahel and so on. And the RECs are another thing because they are institutionalized. So, and then I guess a follow-up question for that would be whether the RECs, if you see that in the future as something continuing parallel to these ad hoc coalitions, or if they are gradually going to have less and less importance, or if they continue to have an importance as that you said, that this institutional exploitation, that they will maintain as some sort of parallel institutions where you can just borrow, pull and plug, let's say, from these RECs. How do you see that evolution?
Yeah. So for those, I don't know how many of you are kind of deep into the knowledge of African Standby Force and the kind of how the doctrine documents of the African Union, but basically it recognizes 5 regional economic communities or regional mechanisms as those are the ones that should deploy in crisis, etc. And then there are different, scenarios for when they should deploy and so forth.
Four already.
And of those 5, for example, the East African Commission is not part of it. There's and they deployed to the eastern Congo. So there's like quite a few. And then, for example, for Chad and the Lake Chad situation, this kind of straddled 2 different economic communities. So it was difficult to use it. So they took a slumbering organization that you mentioned, the Lake Chad Basin Commission, and revived it and tried to make it into something that was, more...
I wouldn't say it was slumbering. I think they revitalized it, but also, as I said, I think when it was first, before it was remandated for the AU, it was designed to deal with banditry. So it was really repurposing something at a local level and scaling that up.
In 95, 20 years before. And it hadn't really had much activity in the meantime. It had a mandate on banditry. Anyway, that was also not a recognized unit of this doctrine. So it was between. Again, why I would call it the ad hoc coalition, because it's not recognized in the doctrine. And it didn't seek for a mandate because it had a very strong lead state. Nigeria didn't want it. They didn't want South Africa to meddle into their business, basically, for natural reasons. And that's also what we're going to see, I think, in other situations. So strong lead states, hesitant to involve the African Union to a top level because they want to stay in control. That's why I think ad hoc coalitions are becoming the preferred alternative. If you can then get a recognition from the African Union or endorsement or even an authorization so that you can access Western donor money, good. Then you have combined your interests. You tick all the boxes.
Jonathan?
My question is whether the RECs will continue as a pull and plug mechanism. Do you think that they will stay, ECOWAS, for example, or SADC, will they stay in parallel, or will they gradually just disappear after this ad hoc coalition?
They have to show the relevance over time. If not, I think this is this goes as for peacekeeping. If you don't use the mechanisms that have been, a lot of Western and donor money has been spent into building up these RECs, the Eastern Standby Force, I don't think is going to be used at all. Then you have to change it around, probably. And
Jonathan?
Jonathan.
Andrew, I'm sure he could have something to say about this.
Always
But
have something to say.
we are swiftly moving on.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not wearing it because I got a bit of water on it. I'm not hugely comfortable on putting this if it's got water on it, so that's why I'm holding it like this. Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned ceremonial. Was that the word that you used about what the functions these things now provide? And I think there is something quite interesting still on that last point about the legitimizing nature of some of these endorsements and recognition, or like at least it tells us something about the nature of African politics, or the politics of the African continent, in terms of what is seen as being a legitimate process whereby you intervene in another country. Because I remember actually back in 2014 or 2013 when Sudan civil war started, South Sudan civil war, and Uganda kind of went in all guns blazing bilaterally, and there was a lot of criticism in IGAD and East Africa about, this is not how you're meant to intervene anymore. It's meant to go this way, and you're meant to have these, regional or continental bodies endorsements. So I think there's something interesting about the function that these authorizations actually serve now. And yes, it may well be that it doesn't really do very much in terms of the capacity of regional organizations, but it tells us something about the way in which African states now think about the processes whereby you should intervene. And then that's arguably something, this kind of post-hocism is something that's been going on for a while. I mean, the AMISOM operation in Somalia, that's basically a continuous renegotiation of what is acceptable, in the sense that, it was originally meant to be no neighboring states were involved at all, and then practically all of the neighboring states invaded, and then they were rehatted as part of the so that's a kind of longer term trend which now seems to be happening in a slightly different way, but it's there's been a continuous testing, I think, of some of the boundaries of what constitutes legitimate and not legitimate intervention, and I think we're seeing a kind of finessing of that now.
Marsha, we're taking just all of you.
Okay. Can people hear me here? I'm sorry, I essentially waterboarded Jonathan underneath by spilling my water and hopefully not damaging your computer, but I apologize for that. If I'm going to continue the military metaphors that we've all been using and that I've essentially critiqued in my opening talk. Okay, so I'm going to just take this in a slightly different, from a slightly different perspective, but I did just want to say before I do that, who would have thunk it that John and I would actually almost come to similar conclusions from very, very different analytical starting points. But in a way, you just sort of proved that peacekeeping has a very complicated, if not slowly strangled future. But for very different reasons, I think, in terms of its efficacy. So I guess I'm just really curious as to how these discussions around the future of these different actors in the sort of peacekeeping landscape, how this discussion relates to other kinds of discussions that are attempting to reform security institutions. So I'm really curious how, say, for example, Black Lives Matters movement has been campaigning towards this defund the police, and there's been a lot of debate amongst different organizations about, well, what do you do in the absence of the police? We need the police, we need law and order, we need all these kinds of things. But then there has been, alternatives suggested even as well, showcased in the Ghanaian context around community policing. There's all this return to thinking about, softer forms of security. So I'm just curious what the peacekeeping literature and scholarship says to these other kinds of, well, I wouldn't call them necessarily anti-militarist, but they're attempts to either abolish or reform these kinds of security institutions that are clearly not supported publicly or supported even within civil society more broadly. And then I guess I would sort of extend that to sort of say, like, what would peacekeeping look like? Like, if we ask the question the other way, what would peacekeeping look like if we took the martial aspects of it out? Would it be, colonial forms of development? Would it be like, the long-standing problematic versions of humanitarianism that we've seen accompany peacekeeping? Like, so what would it look like if we sort of literally sort of vacuumed the military underbelly of it out? I'm not suggesting I'm not backing down from my abolition of peacekeeping.
Don't do it, Marsha.
It's taken me 20 years. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm curious because I'm not opposed to a conversation where we think about, like, well, if we were going to replace it, if it is failing in so many regards, if other actors are actually racking up the number of kills, then what would it look like? So if not me, I'm not going to imagine it, but what would it look like if we took the martial out and we thought about the other kinds of governance motivations or other kind of governance cultures that could do it? But that's a question for everybody, not any one specific one. Yeah.
I can't really remember your question, but I'm going to answer it directly anyway, to say that I think the biggest problem with peacekeeping is that the ideology behind these big missions in Mali, in the CAR, in Sudan, we don't believe in the ability of peacekeeping missions or the West to actually transform these countries into beautiful, at least stable places where everybody lives in relative harmony. So we don't really believe in what the missions were ideologically, what they were 10 years ago. So that's why we now have these very security-focused, stabilization-focused types of operations, missions, and we don't know what to put in place of the liberal democracy in this idea of going out and changing the world into a better Western place.
But do we need to, though?
So that's why we're having all these conversations. What is it now? What is it coming to? What is it that people want? What is it that these organizations want? So I think, to answer your question, and I think it was so interesting that the UN, what you said, I didn't know that, but the UN doesn't want to change these basic 3 principles of peacekeeping, but they're going to go and do something. But they're going to go and do something else anyway, because you can't even have that conversation right now at the UN. At least agree on what should come in its place. So I think that would be the answer to, I think, your question from my end. Please, Mike.
I can't resist having a second attempt. This time I'm not going to talk about Rwanda. I'm going to talk about Northern Ireland, which is an extremely interesting case, which I'm sure you're going to have ample opportunity to explore, based at Queen's University.
Yeah. So she can answer.
The dimension that you're talking about, the non-military dimension. I mean, let's be clear about this. The British and the Irish governments spent many years trying to find a military solution in Northern Ireland, or a peacekeeping solution, which involved the use of soldiers on the streets and in people's houses and so There were two attempts to get rid of that process. One failed in 1974, and the second one was the Good Friday Agreement, which was the Good Friday Agreement for slow learners, they say. It took a long time for the different parties to understand what peace was all about, and what it required of negotiating abilities and groups and the non-state actors and all this. So there's all kinds of opportunities which just seem to get washed away in some kind of fixation on a bunch of soldiers being sent off to some country X, Y, or Z to build peace, impose peace, whatever you know. I really would be curious that from the five of you or six of you who've studied these, you know, what are some more examples of alternatives where a process is moving more or less. I'm not suggesting peace and harmony has been achieved in Northern Ireland, but there's been a lot of progress if you compare with what the situation was like, say, 20 years ago. So I'd really like to hear what you think about alternatives.
I will just respond very briefly with a anecdote or a share with you. So former colleague of mine from LSE has just published a book on reconciliation by stealth, Denisa Kostovikova. And actually, I think what's really fascinating about this, you know, and it about this book and this research is that, you know, all the things I think peacekeeping is caught very often, the UN and traditional forms of peacekeeping or more recent forms of peacekeeping are really attached emotionally, psychologically, and structurally attached to the forms that peacekeeping has taken over the past 40 years. So it's hard to let go of these practices, these formats, these arrangements. And what Denisa does in the book is to challenge those assumptions about how we can move forward in post-conflict context, what peace means, what it looks like. And so one of the things that she does in the book is to challenge the idea that talking about atrocities, talking about the war, is somehow a hindrance to reconciliation, to justice, or to transitions towards understanding justice. But actually talking and multi-ethnic groups talking together will be a hindrance to peace, towards transitional justice. Her research uncovers the exact opposite, that actually sitting in multi-ethnic conversations, that talking about atrocities, talking about violence, actually leads towards some kind of good deliberation, as she calls it, or to some aspects of reconciliation, not the opposite. And I think peacekeeping scholarship and peacekeeping practices can also learn from these, you know, to challenge those prescribed or those understood sort of mechanisms and practices. That's you know, a much broader response, but yeah, that's one way of looking at it. That, you know, I mean, the opposite of course is that you go back to traditional peacekeeping, but where's that going to happen? Like, you know, we're not going to have green lines and buffer zones anymore. It's not, yeah.
Anybody who wants to say something, Jonathan?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll go. I suppose, I mean, part of the answer to that would be about context. I think one of the positive developments that comes, I suppose, with the lack of confidence in multilateralism and so on and so forth is the gradual acceptance by, whether or not it actually, you know, translates into practicalities, but the gradual notional acceptance that you can't just apply one model everywhere across the world. And I guess peacekeeping has a problem because that is basically what it's based on, effectively, or at least kind of institutionally and intellectually. So yeah, I mean, because, you know, if you look at examples, you know, Somaliland or Rwanda post 1994, like those are very, very different models, if you like, of how countries or you know, organizations of political actors recover from conflict without peacekeeping in and of itself. But you can't necessarily, and whether or not you would want to replicate those in different contexts is a wider question. So I think it's how can you get a highly bureaucratized, institutionalized framework which is embedded in a particular type of thinking and politics, how can you disaggregate that and make that something which is context specific? And I'm not really sure if that's very feasible. I think the other thing I would say briefly about this is that I guess we are starting to see in some of the cases we talked about today what is an alternative in reality to some of the UN multilateral peacekeeping operations in Africa, and what we can take away from that, I think, so far is the preeminent role and power of the state and state actors. Whether or not that's a good thing, I think in many cases it isn't, for a whole host of reasons. But we are seeing, once you don't have these multilateral operations, that the power of the state comes in, and you might say, well, actually that's been a trend when it comes to African, continental approaches, going all the way back to the 1960s and attempts to create the OAU and all that sort of thing. So we are seeing an alternative, but it may be not particularly good alternative in many cases.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to answer your question directly, but perhaps say that we're not looking at UN peacekeeping the same way today as we did maybe 10 years ago, because we're not intervening in the same types of contexts anymore. So we're often, and this has been said often, but surprisingly not, we haven't talked about it today, that often the UN peace operations or these ad hoc coalitions are intervening in war and not in a place where there is already a peace agreement that's stable and fixated, right? So we're not seeing peacekeeping as it was imagined, and that's also why these three principles are basically very hard to apply, because we're going in and taking the side of one of the actors, and most of the time we're taking the side of the state actor, like in Mali, for example. And when the state actor then is not legitimate for the at least half of the population, then it's very hard, because the UN becomes seen as one of the fighting parties, and then we have this discussion about UN peacekeepers, protection of UN peacekeepers. So I think that's also something that, okay, we see this evolution in peacekeeping operations, but that's also because the context has changed, and we see a different types of war, not interstate war anymore, but these types of complex, sometimes low intensity conflicts with different types of non-state armed actors like jihadists, which is also then reshaping the type of operation that's coming in. I had a question again. I'm sorry, I'm asking so many questions.
No, you can't. It's not you two. You can.
but I take advantage of having excellent colleagues. So Marsha, for your abolition of peacekeeping, my automatic, so I haven't read it, I'm going to read your book as soon as it comes out. My automatic reflection on that is, what's the alternative? Because I think we all agree that peacekeeping is problematic and is a very difficult position right now. But as far as I'm concerned, these ad hoc coalitions, these whatever they are, regional or stabilization, they lack all the legitimacy. Like, for whatever we can say about the UN, it has some sort of legitimacy because it's made up.
Why do you take that for granted?
Of all
why do you take that for granted, that the UN has legitimacy?
Well, I'm coming to that, because we have almost 180 member states of it. So it's some sort of an organization where there's inclusivity in it, and which was what John was saying is lacking in these ad hoc coalitions, where you have 2-3 states that are interested in stabilizing a situation quite rapidly for different reasons. So if we see UN as some sort of international organization, inclusive international organization, so what is then, are these ad hoc regional initiatives for you, are they the alternative, or is there any, well, I guess I'm coming back to your question, is there any other alternative than this?
Say that there are different kinds of reconciliation processes that can take place that don't involve peacekeeping. But to answer your question, I guess, Nina, my beef with peacekeeping is that the legitimacy, when we were talking about the, Andrew, when you were talking about, the exaggeration of Wagner and its presence and its influence, I feel that that's the case where we end up focusing a large concentration and put a lot of importance on legitimacy at a very superficial level. So legitimacy is also lost through these violations. over a very long period of time. These are not just like a small group of Canadian peacekeepers who committed this particular violation and they were a group of bad apples. If you look, unfortunately, the way Paris looks at, is he weighs up, takes a survey of, some 12 peacekeeping missions, generally not the kind of peacekeeping missions that we've just been talking about in the last 15, 20 minutes, much more uniform kind of peacekeeping. And he, measures like
Very
Portman
superficially.
does. So overall, he argues after writing that peacekeepings were a civilizing mission, the later work says, if we weigh this all up, actually, they're more good than bad. But again, that's like, I feel like we're juggling a series of numbers that don't really paint a very good picture overall. And if we looked at the impact and influence, it would be the extent of sort of really like misery and suffering that has been caused or has been perpetuated or helped along by peacekeeping, then we might assess these things a bit differently. And I think like in terms of the main question that you asked, which is like, well, what is the alternative? And I just keep going back to that like final chapter in Razik's book where she says she's continually asked, which is when she was, this is 20 years ago now almost, right? 2004. So that she was continually asked, well, okay, so what is the solution? What is the solution? Okay, so you take the peacekeeping is bad. Okay, we agree with you. What is the solution? And she's like that. This is my back out, kind of conclusion, which is like, but that actually that keeps us in the argument that peacekeeping has that.
Yeah, but
that
it's
right in the first place. That it's we start from this presumption of arrogance about peacekeeping as inherently we assume it has inherently good properties.
and it's
That's for me the problem. Not like we could talk about success stories of various types of movements. We could talk about accidental success where the peacekeeping mission leaves and then, in the vacuum comes civil society and creates at least to some kind of temper. So I guess I think the question is important to continually ask, but I think we need to start like reversing the gaze in terms of when we think about, well, maybe it's not up to us as scholars. Maybe it's the military has to respond with something, or maybe.
But also, I think that underlying that question is also it's this idea that is also a lot in the international community. It's better to do something than nothing.
Yes. Yeah.
We might not be able to sort of deal with this conflict, but at least we're doing something, and something that sometimes that doing something actually makes it worse. And I don't think we are sort of accepting our own sort of limitations by that. So there's something in that question that sort of where are the sort of the borders. Now Louisa wants me to be quiet, but I will ask John to.
I don't know,
Did you want to just say something to this, and then we'll?
Yeah, but at the same time, I want to have more things from the audience. Yeah.
So, Louis,
No, there's more.
yeah, I think you were first, Michael, to be honest, and then Louisa. But maybe we could take both.
Louisa and I always agree because I think
that's boring.
To go when we walk out of here, we should actually have an opposing view as well, because this is kind of a very pessimistic view on UN peacekeeping, and I don't agree as a practitioner. I think there's still remit a lot of it in UN peacekeeping. We have not maybe been doing too well, but I think the framework was there. For example, in Mali, we had a political solution, a peace agreement, and there were the consent of the parties, the platform, the coordination, and the government to actually implement it. And we were actually impartial. We were not pro-government in the implementation of this peace agreement. And there, I think the construct for a peacekeeping mission was definitely there, and it made a lot of sense to bring in. And I would also like to stress, the military, don't see the military as the most important. I would like to stress that. We know we're just one tool in the whole toolbox, and the political is the most important thing. The political element, the development, and all that human rights element and so on are the key. the military can keep the wheat down. The reason why I think that all these ad hoc arrangements are coming up now is because there's no peace agreements, there are no solutions, and somebody needs somebody else to kill somebody. This is basically what it is, and UN cannot do counterterrorism. So we need also to find a construct where a peacekeeping mission can work together with a counterterrorism, and we actually had that also in Mali. We worked with Barkhane, we worked with G5 Sahel, and so on, and that construct is possible also. So before ruling out, I would like to think in the future, I could see a peacekeeping construct in Gaza. I could see a peacekeeping construct in Yemen. I could see a peacekeeping, even further out, I could see a peacekeeping construct in Ukraine as well. And then there would probably be no NATO forces there, but there would be limitations on that. But I still can see the construct with the overall political solution being there that needs to have an integrated approach in its implementation, supported by military and maybe also police. So I think I would caution not ruling UN peacekeeping out. Thank you.
Can I just add?
No, you cannot. Louisa is going to now oppose what Michael is saying. Okay, just.
I don't dare to oppose Michael. That would be no.
I
But
wouldn't either,
just to echo or follow up on what Michael said, I think we also need to be careful about using the term peacekeeping, because as you mentioned, a lot of the things we've been talking about are not peacekeeping. It's stabilisation, it's counterinsurgency, it's counterterrorism, and I haven't really seen any actor out there, organizational action, that has been efficient at doing that. And a lot of other actors have done it with a lot of more resources than the UN has at their hand. I mean, you talked about how expensive UN peacekeeping or UN operations are, but they still, I mean, the tiny amount of military budgets they consume compared to what the rest of the world are using on military interventions. We also have to keep that in mind, sort of. Everything is relative. They are big, but big compared to what? And then finally, the last sort of counterfactual argument, you think, what about all the countries or cases where we didn't succeed in intervening, where there hasn't been a UN intervention? How have things progressed there? Are things that much better in Syria, in Myanmar? And, there are lots of places where there has been no UN peacekeeping, and I'm not, suggesting that that's the only reason things are as they are there, but we also have to keep that counterfactual argument when we sort of dismiss the UN peacekeeping. I agree, it's very easy to criticize UN peacekeeping, but it's very easy to criticize all military interventions everywhere. And I think we have to keep that in mind as well. And then the last thing is also, as Andrew mentioned, with all of these ad hocism, that the thing they lack is precisely what the UN multidimensional operations that you are dismissing have. So how do we keep, and in the future, how do we make sure that all of these things that we need, the civilian side, the political side, how do we keep that on board, even as we have more kinetic, robust, military, violent interventions? Thank you.
Andrew is the first one
to try and answer
respond.
both questions, your last question and the gentleman's question. I think for me, one of the things that we have been colleagues at NUPI and have been arguing for is really about this idea of a more broader adaptive stabilization process, which includes not only the military aspects, but as you said, for someone that said, this idea of political, because in essence, the military is not going to deploy unless the political actors say deploy. They don't just randomly get up and deploy. There has to be some sort of aspect or some sort of political will behind it. But I think here, that more broader adaptive stabilization process, which is about not just learning what you do, economic aspects, you bring in the UNDP. For me, the clearest example here, again, is the Lake Chad Basin Commission, where it works towards a strategy. The multinational joint task force works towards that. And despite what has been said about the multinational joint task force, the number of operations that are actually being conducted by the force are less than 10. So this idea that it's, going around killing everyone, relative, because actually what you might find is that the actual individual states are the ones carrying out that. So for me, again, what is the broader aspect that we're trying to do? I would argue that looking at that example, not saying we should copy and paste, because I think that's where others have gone wrong in that, but looking at the context is important, but also looking at more devolution of powers. How do we move, and to bring back to your point about Northern Ireland, how do you move towards this bottom up but trickle down? So where I wouldn't say federalism is the best model, but again, maybe something like that where governors and locals get to decide on their future, get to decide, okay, this is the strategy that we're going to deploy, this is how we're going to do it, and these are the things that we're going to use to assess. And then how does the military maybe connect with that to create the space for them to be able to flourish and for communities to return? So for me, it's really about that focus. Now, what I argue that it's not good that we should be doing is saying, okay, we've got this pot of money, who are the state actors? Actually, it needs to be this state. And that's where we've historically gone wrong, because states don't want to deal with anything below that. And so we keep on making the same mistake. My first experience of peacekeeping and anything post-conflict was Nepal, where the state or the UN constantly focused on the state in Kathmandu and had nothing to do with anything going outside, because why? It was hard to reach. But again, what does that do for the people on the ground? So again, for me, that people-centric, more adaptive, broader stabilization where we encapsulate everything from climate security to conflict resolution to peace building, that's where, for me, it sits. We can no longer just keep on looking at security only. And that's why I say adult security initiatives, yes, they serve a purpose, but they also have contradictions within their long term, because again, they're not designed to be there forever. Create the space, create the stability, and then allow for the state to come in. The question is, if the state isn't coming in, then that's really what we should be looking at. So for me, that devolution of power is important. And I'll leave it there.
We're at the final sort of words from the speakers, so choose them wisely. But I think maybe John can
No, so don't read me wrongly. I'm actually a supporter of UN peacekeeping, and I worked for it myself in the previous days. But of course, there's particular criteria that have to be in place for a mission to succeed, and that's unfortunately been kind of the case a lot lately. That missions have been deployed into situations where they simply don't fit. And so the tool has been kind of tarnished by that, I would say. Will the tool have a place in the future? From my presentation, probably it didn't look like it. But it has, peacekeeping has died before and resurrected, so we might be surprised again. Maybe a bit on the low side, but the current planning for the Haiti mission, it's a policing mission. That's what has been passed at the council, multinational security force, so a coalition. Is there any invitation or effort on the judiciary? So the other parts, corrections, so prisons? No, because they don't want to have an intervention into kind of internal affairs. Will they succeed then? Probably not. So maybe after enough failures, we will see a return. But that's unfortunate for those who have to go through those and live through those failures. Yeah.
Yep. So I get the point that both Marsha and Peter said, that if we continue to ask what's the alternative, well, we are still in the same framework. And then we don't come further in that discussion. But then I also see Louis' points that if we then do the counterfactual one, because it's not like if there are no UN peacekeeping, that things will just automatically become better. Like things won't solve themselves. And I think there is an article by Edward Luttwak about like let the war continue and then see how far it goes. And I mean, if that's the alternative, because even if we say, okay, let's don't talk about alternative, then we still have to see what's happening in its place in somehow. And for me, I think I would say that yes, UN has definitely lost legitimacy over the past years, decades, because of all these multiple sexual scandals and so on, and because of the lack of tangible results in many different situations. But I do think I still think that they have more legitimacy than any of these ad hoc coalitions that we see surfacing right now, because of the framework, because of the rules that are trying to control how the soldiers are behaving, and so on and so on. And then to come back, I think I do agree with Andrew and with Marsha that Wagner Group has been overemphasized in Africa for many reasons. One of them is, of course, that it invites other Western forces to combat the Wagner troops in Africa, because we're in this geopolitical power competition, let's say. But I also think that it's wrong to compare Wagner to French troops, for example. Wagner are mercenaries without any rules. They're not under any institutional accountability mechanism at all.
Such a normative
and
argument.
Yeah, and well, I mean,
from a very situated, not a very specific perspective.
Yeah.
I think that you can't compare French forces today with the Wagner mercenaries. It's two different types of institutions. I'm not saying that the French. I'm not trying to defend the French behavior or anything. I just think that there are two different types of institutions. One is a mercenary that's
I'm a fan of your clarity, really.
Sorry,
I'm a fan of your clarity.
Yeah.
in your it's
and
clear.
the other not. But yeah, I think that they're definitely overemphasized. And then finally, to Michael, I think that MINUSMA was objective in the sense that they were the mediator for the peace agreement, but in their mandate it was to re-establish state authority across the country. So it's automatically then towards the state and the government rather than the opposition parties. So in that case, it's not really a neutral force.
That and because we're 5 minutes past, so Jonathan, Marsha, make it big and make it.
All right, I'll try and be quick.
Let's go out with a bang.
Yeah, I think you're right about the problem with the language of peacekeeping. This is something that Nina and I struggled with quite a lot in our book, which is called African Peacekeeping. But if you want to take a very technical perspective, a lot of what we talk about is not peacekeeping. But I think it speaks to how embedded the idea of peacekeeping is, beyond just a kind of what it is technically or how the UN defines it, and sort of the ideology of peacekeeping kind of brings in some of these different types of missions. And it's interesting the language that some African leaders use about some of these, where it's peace is in there somewhere. It's like as in enforcing the peace, or when there isn't a peace to be enforced. But yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is that it's very difficult to know what kind of language you can use to describe some of these missions without just kind of circling the drainpipe of inventing your own kind of concept. Especially because a lot of the way in which they're talked about by political elites draws on the history of peacekeeping as a discourse and an idea, even if what's actually happening is that wouldn't conform to UN peacekeeping or whatever. I think the other thing I would say very quickly about what about places where there haven't been an intervention? It's interesting because obviously a lot of the discussion about African peacekeeping came after Rwanda and the formation of the AU and so on and so forth, and this idea that there should be a functioning continental or even wider system which should prevent things like the Rwandan genocide happening. And it's interesting because Rwanda's initial engagement in peacekeeping often went through the UN because it was directly, as you may well know, they were trying to bolster the UN system because they felt that it had let them down. But I think what's happening now, and them sort of moving away from that into these more bilateral missions, indicates what Marsha was saying, the kind of gradual erosion of trust in the UN and the multilateral system as an institution. So these things do change. And I think the only other thing I would say is that we shouldn't necessarily assume that all of these different missions have a kind of particularly African understanding of what they're trying to impose or introduce. I mean, I've done some research, many other colleagues have done research on the way in which kind of liberal peace-building ideas and peacekeeping ideas are embedded in some African-led missions, including, for example, the AU mission in Somalia, and the actual approaches taken by Uganda and Kenya and Ethiopia. They kind of represent particular understandings of how you build a state, which are not a million miles away from something that Max Weber would have understood 150 years ago. So I think that's an important clarification to some of this discussion today. Yeah, that's me done.
Final word, Marsha.
I would just say that just one last plug for my book, which is not yet out. The original title of the book was they didn't like it, the publishers. It was called Critical Interventions. You will remember that I gave a talk with that title. And the critical interventions part was the importance that we put on peacekeeping as that's critical to saving lives, but also, was it not working? Have I just turned it on mute? Yeah. Oh, sorry. And then, but also the importance of, you know, the critical nature of critical theories to help us along. And I think that's, you know, if I leave this, you know, this talk with anything, or, you know, if I leave you with anything, it's just like the importance of thinking about these, you know, different responses and different positionings in the literature, but with the help of all kinds of critical tools that we might have, whether they come from, you know, the ground up from practice, from the peace kept, and or whether they come from, you know, theorists and political philosophers. I was going to say politicians, but maybe we'll just leave them out. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. And thank you all of you for coming today and giving fabulous, very interesting talks. Thank you to all of you also for listening and staying here for 3 hours and 10 minutes.
Yeah, wow.
Dismissed.
Impressive.